Tonight, we return to a time when the world felt larger. Not because the land itself was wider, but because certainty was beginning to fade, slowly, almost unnoticed, across the lives of those who lived within it. There was once an empire so vast that its roads connected distant lives, and so structured that its presence could be felt even in the smallest village. Yet, over time, that presence began to soften, not disappearing all at once, but gradually, as if the world itself was learning how to move differently. It is easy to imagine the fall of such a power as a single moment, a final turning point where everything changes at once. But what if it felt instead like an ordinary day, one that passed quietly, much like the countless days before it, without any clear sign that history itself was shifting beneath it? And in that quiet, almost imperceptible change, a new way of living was already beginning to take shape. In the years that followed the height of Roman power, life did not come to a halt, nor did the world suddenly collapse into chaos. Instead, it began to change its rhythm, gradually, almost gently, as familiar patterns loosened and new ones slowly took their place. The great roads still stretched across the land, their stones worn smooth by generations of footsteps, and for a time they continued to carry travelers. Merchants moving between towns, soldiers delivering messages, and families journeying toward places they hoped would offer stability. But over time, these movements became less frequent, and although the physical distance between places remained the same, it began to feel greater, as if the invisible threads that once connected distant regions were slowly weakening. City gates still opened each morning, and markets still gathered in familiar squares. Yet something subtle had shifted. The crowds were smaller, the voices less constant, and the sense of order that once defined daily life began to feel more distant, less immediate, and harder to rely upon. As this continued, attention gradually turned away from the great centers of power and toward the land itself, where life could be sustained more directly. Fields became more important than forums, and harvests more dependable than distant decisions made by unseen authorities. In these quieter spaces, a different kind of life began to take shape, one that moved with the seasons rather than with imperial commands. Families worked the soil, measured time through cycles of growth and rest, and relied more on those around them than on institutions far away. And as this happened, the idea of Rome did not vanish completely. It remained in language, in habits, and in the memory of how things once were, but its presence became softer, less immediate, until it felt more like something remembered than something actively lived. In that space, where structure had once been firm and clearly defined, new patterns began to emerge, not through grand design, but through small, practical adjustments. Local leaders took on greater roles, customs became more personal, and communities learned to organize themselves in ways that reflected their immediate needs. As I reflect on this moment, there is something unexpectedly quiet in the way such a vast system receded. Not with a dramatic ending, but through countless small changes, each one almost invisible on its own, yet powerful when taken together. And in the years that followed, these small changes would begin to gather, slowly forming something new, something not yet fully understood, but already taking shape beneath the surface of everyday life. Even now, in this early transition, the direction was beginning to reveal itself. And beyond the horizon, new forces were already moving, steadily and without urgency, toward the lands that Rome had once defined. As this period continued, something subtle had already begun to shift. Not in a way that could be easily seen from a distance, but in the small details of everyday life, where the structure of a vast empire was slowly becoming less certain, less immediate, and more difficult to hold together. For generations, the Roman Empire had relied on systems that felt almost permanent. Roads that connected distant provinces, laws that applied across vast territories, and an authority that reached from the center outward with remarkable consistency. Yet over time, these systems required more effort to maintain, and that effort was becoming harder to sustain. Taxes grew heavier in some regions, while in others they became harder to collect. Trade routes that once carried goods with relative ease began to face interruptions, and the movement of resources, so essential to the stability of the empire, became less predictable than it had once been. In the cities, life still continued, and for many, the changes were not immediately obvious. Markets still opened, people still gathered, and daily routines remained familiar. Yet, beneath that surface, there was a growing sense that the structures supporting this life were no longer as stable as they had once been. As this happened, local communities began to rely more on themselves than on distant authority. Decisions that had once been made by imperial officials were increasingly handled by local leaders, not through any grand reform, but simply because it had become necessary. And beyond the borders, movement was already underway. Groups of people from the north and east, often described later as invaders, were in many cases searching for land, for security, and for a place within a world that was itself changing. Some entered Roman territory gradually, settling as farmers or soldiers, integrating into existing communities. Others arrived through conflict, testing the weakened edges of imperial control. Yet, in both cases, they became part of a transformation that had already begun. Over time, the distinction between Roman and non-Roman became less clear. Customs blended, languages shifted, and identities adapted to new realities, forming societies that were no longer defined by a single center of power, but by a mixture of traditions and practices. In the year 476, a moment often described as the fall of the Western Roman Empire took place, when a young emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was removed from power by a Germanic leader named Odoacer. Yet, even this moment, which history would later highlight, did not feel like a dramatic ending to those who lived through it, and there was no single collapse that reshaped the world overnight. No clear line separating one era from the next. Instead, life continued, much as it had the day before, with people tending to their work, caring for their families, and adapting to circumstances that were changing slowly, almost imperceptibly. As I reflect on this transition, there is something unexpectedly quiet in the way such a vast system receded. Not through a single event, but through countless small adjustments, each one shaped by necessity, each one responding to conditions that no longer supported the old structure. And in the years that followed, these changes would continue to unfold. Local rulers would gain influence. New kingdoms would begin to form, and the familiar unity of Rome would give way to a landscape defined by smaller, more localized centers of power. Yet at this moment, standing within the transition itself, none of this would have felt fully clear. It was simply a time of adjustment, of gradual change, and of lives continuing forward without a clear sense of the larger transformation taking place around them. And as this quiet shift continued, new forms of leadership were beginning to emerge, shaped not by empire, but by land, loyalty, and the need for protection in an increasingly uncertain world. As the years moved forward and the structure of empire continued to recede into memory, life did not become empty or directionless. Instead, it settled into new patterns, shaped less by distant authority and more by the immediate needs of the land, the seasons, and the communities that remained. For many, the most noticeable change was not the absence of an emperor, but the growing importance of local life. Where once decisions had come from far away, now they were made closer to home, by those who understood the land, the people, and the quiet rhythms that guided daily survival. In the countryside, which now held a larger share of the population than before, days were shaped by work that was steady and familiar. Tending fields, caring for animals, repairing tools, and preparing for seasons that could not be ignored. Because here, unlike in the cities of the past, survival depended directly on the success of each harvest. Homes were simple, often built from wood, earth, and thatch, materials gathered from nearby surroundings. And within these homes, life followed a rhythm that repeated itself with small variations, day after day, year after year, creating a sense of continuity even as the larger world changed. In these communities, people relied heavily on one another, not through formal systems, but through shared understanding and necessity. Neighbors helped neighbors, families worked together, and knowledge was passed not through written texts, but through observation, memory, and experience. And while the great urban centers of the Roman world had begun to shrink, they did not disappear entirely. Some remained as modest towns, their grand structures repurposed, their spaces adapted to fit a quieter scale of life. Where once there had been crowds, now there were smaller gatherings. And where once there had been spectacle, now there was routine. As this transformation continued, trade did not vanish, but it became more localized. Long-distance exchange grew less reliable, while nearby networks became more important. Goods moved shorter distances, and communities adapted to producing more of what they needed themselves. This shift toward self-sufficiency brought with it a different sense of stability, one that was not dependent on the reach of empire, but on the resilience of local systems. And, although this stability could be fragile, it was also deeply rooted in the immediate environment. At the same time, new cultural influences were beginning to blend with the remnants of Roman tradition. The Germanic peoples who had settled across former imperial lands brought with them their own customs, their own ways of organizing society, and their own understanding of law and loyalty. Rather than replacing what had come before, these traditions gradually merged with Roman practices, creating hybrid systems that reflected both continuity and change, where written law might exist alongside customary judgment, and where identity was shaped by both heritage and circumstance. In this evolving world, loyalty often shifted from distant institutions to personal relationships. Bonds between leaders and followers became more significant, not because they were formally required, but because they offered protection, stability, and a sense of belonging in uncertain times. As I reflect on this period, there is something deeply human in the way people adapted, not by resisting change, but by working within it, adjusting their lives in ways that allowed them to continue, even when the structures they had once relied upon were no longer present. And over time, these small adjustments began to define the character of the age, a world less unified, yet more localized, less structured, yet more personal, shaped not by a single power, but by countless communities finding their own way forward. In the years that followed, these patterns would continue to develop, gradually forming the foundations of new kingdoms, new systems of authority, and new ways of organizing society. Yet, even as these changes took shape, another force was quietly growing in influence, one that did not rely on armies or territory alone, but on belief, tradition, and a shared sense of meaning. And it was within this emerging force that a new kind of stability would begin to form. As this quieter world continued to take shape, and communities learned to rely more on what was near than on what was distant, another presence was becoming steadily more visible, not through sudden power, but through consistency, structure, and a sense of meaning that reached beyond daily survival. In towns that had grown smaller, and in villages that now carried the weight of everyday life, places of worship began to take on a different role, not only as centers of belief, but as points of gathering, guidance, and quiet continuity in a world that no longer felt as unified as it once had. For many, the church offered something that had become increasingly rare, a sense of order that did not depend on political stability, and a framework of understanding that remained steady even as external structures shifted. Clergy, whether bishops in towns or priests in rural communities, became familiar figures in daily life, not distant authorities, but present voices who helped interpret events, offer counsel, and maintain a sense of connection between the spiritual and the everyday. Over time, their responsibilities extended beyond worship alone. They recorded events, mediated disputes, organized assistance for those in need, and helped preserve knowledge that might otherwise have been lost as older systems faded. In this way, the church began to fill spaces that had once been occupied by imperial administration, not replacing it entirely, but adapting to the needs of a changing society, offering forms of stability that felt accessible and immediate. At the same time, a broader network was forming, one that connected distant communities through shared belief, shared practices, and a common language of worship, creating a sense of unity that stretched across regions, even as political structures remained fragmented. As this network expanded, certain figures began to stand out, individuals whose influence extended beyond their immediate surroundings, shaping the direction of the church and its role within society. Among them was Gregory, later known as Gregory the Great, who lived during a time when the city of Rome itself faced uncertainty. Rather than relying on distant authority, he worked to organize resources, support the population, and negotiate with external threats, demonstrating how spiritual leadership could also serve practical needs. Under his guidance, the church became more than a place of worship. It became a source of coordination, care, and continuity, helping communities navigate a world that no longer followed the patterns of empire. At the same time, efforts were made to reach beyond established regions. Missions were sent to areas where older beliefs still remained, not through force, but through gradual persuasion, conversation, and the steady presence of those who carried these teachings with them. As these efforts continued, belief itself became a unifying thread, one that connected individuals across distances, offering not only spiritual meaning, but also a shared identity that could exist alongside local traditions and customs. And yet, this growth was not defined by sudden expansion, but by gradual influence, by relationships formed over time, by trust built through consistency, and by the ability to adapt to different communities without losing a sense of core purpose. As I reflect on this development, there is something quietly significant in the way the church emerged during this period, not as a force that replaced what had been lost, but as one that grew within the spaces left behind, shaping itself according to the needs of the people it served. In many ways, it offered a different kind of structure, one that was less visible than imperial authority, yet deeply present in the rhythms of daily life, guiding not through command, but through continuity, shared belief, and a sense of belonging. And in the years that followed, this presence would continue to strengthen, forming connections across regions, influencing leaders, and gradually becoming one of the most stable institutions in a world that was still learning how to organize itself. Yet even as this stability grew, another form of life was beginning to take root alongside it. Quieter still, more withdrawn, yet deeply influential in its own way. And it was within these quiet spaces, removed from the noise of everyday concerns, that something important was being preserved, carefully, patiently, and with remarkable dedication. As this presence of the church continued to grow, and its influence reached further into daily life, there were some who chose a different path. one that moved away from towns and communities and toward places of quiet, distance, and reflection. In these more remote settings, often far from the centers of activity, small groups began to form. Not around power or governance, but around a shared desire for simplicity, discipline, and a life shaped by devotion rather than necessity alone. These were the beginnings of monastic life, where individuals gathered not to lead others, but to withdraw from the uncertainties of the world, creating spaces that followed a different rhythm, one marked by prayer, work, and careful routine. The environments they chose were often simple: valleys, hillsides, or isolated stretches of land where the demands of the outside world felt distant. And within these places, a quiet order began to emerge, structured not by external authority, but by shared commitment. Over time, this way of life became more organized, especially through the influence of figures such as Benedict, whose guidelines helped shape what monastic communities would become. His approach was neither extreme nor harsh, but balanced, emphasizing stability, moderation, and a rhythm that could be sustained over time. Within these communities, each day followed a pattern that repeated with gentle consistency: periods of prayer, moments of labor, and intervals of rest, creating a sense of continuity that stood in contrast to the unpredictability of the world beyond their walls. Work itself was not separate from devotion. Tending gardens, maintaining buildings, preparing food, all became part of a larger rhythm, where even the simplest tasks carried meaning through repetition and intention. And in these quiet spaces, something else began to take place, something that would have lasting importance far beyond the walls of these communities. Texts were being copied, slowly, carefully, line by line, by hands that worked with patience and attention, preserving writings that might otherwise have faded as the structures of the old world continued to recede. These were not only religious texts, but also works from earlier times, fragments of knowledge, philosophy, and history that found a place within these environments, protected not through urgency, but through steady, deliberate care. The act of copying itself required focus, a quiet dedication that mirrored the broader rhythm of monastic life. And through this work, ideas were carried forward, not as something urgent, but as something worth preserving for reasons that were not always fully known at the time. In this way, monasteries became more than places of withdrawal. They became centers of continuity, holding together pieces of a world that was changing, and ensuring that certain forms of knowledge would remain accessible in the generations that followed. At the same time, these communities often extended their presence outward in subtle ways, offering shelter to travelers, providing assistance to nearby populations, and serving as points of stability in regions where other structures had become uncertain. As I reflect on this, there is something deeply calm in the role these places played, not seeking to shape the world through force or influence, but simply maintaining a rhythm that allowed both people and knowledge to endure. And over time, this quiet persistence would have far-reaching effects, as ideas preserved within these walls would later find their way back into broader society, shaping developments in ways that could not have been predicted. Yet, in this moment, none of that future was fully visible. There were only these communities working steadily, day after day, guided by routine, by belief, and by a commitment to something that extended beyond immediate need. And beyond these quiet centers of reflection, the wider world continued to shift. New powers were forming, new movements were beginning, and in distant regions forces were rising that would soon reshape the balance of entire continents. And as these changes gathered strength, the story of this evolving world was about to widen, reaching beyond the familiar lands of the old empire, and into regions that would bring new challenges, new ideas, and new directions. As the Western lands continued to settle into quieter, more localized rhythms, The story of Rome did not end everywhere in the eastern regions, centered around the city of Constantinople. Something of the old world still endured, not unchanged, but transformed in ways that allowed it to continue. Here, the structures of empire remained more visible. Administration still functioned, laws were maintained, and trade continued to move across long distances, connecting regions that in the West had grown more distant from one another. The city itself, Constantinople, stood at a meeting point of continents where land and sea routes crossed, and where goods, ideas, and cultures moved steadily through its gates. Its walls were strong, its markets active, and its presence felt like a continuation of something that had not yet faded. And yet, even here, change was constant. Emperors worked to preserve what they could, while adapting to pressures both internal and external. Among them was Justinian, whose efforts sought not only to maintain the empire, but to restore parts of what had been lost. Under his rule, campaigns were launched to reclaim territories in the West, and for a time, these efforts succeeded. Lands in Italy and North Africa returned to imperial control, and the idea of a unified Roman world seemed, briefly, within reach once more. At the same time, laws were gathered and organized into what would become a lasting legal foundation, a system that preserved earlier traditions while shaping how governance would function for generations. But these efforts came at a cost. The campaigns placed a strain on resources, and the lands that were reclaimed were often difficult to hold. Over time, the focus shifted again, from expansion to preservation, from reclaiming the past to maintaining what remained. Beyond these borders, another transformation was beginning, one that would soon reshape not only the Eastern world, but much of the lands that had once been part of the Roman sphere. In the deserts of the Arabian Peninsula, communities that had long existed through trade and movement were beginning to form a new kind of unity, one centered not only on shared interests, but on shared belief. This belief, carried through the teachings of a single figure, brought together groups that had previously been divided, offering a sense of direction, purpose, and connection that extended beyond tribal boundaries. As this unity grew, it moved outward, not in a sudden surge, but through a series of expansions that brought new regions into contact with this emerging world. Lands in the Near East, North Africa, and beyond began to shift, gradually becoming part of a different cultural and religious landscape. For the Eastern Empire, this presented a new kind of challenge. Not simply another border conflict, but a transformation that altered long-standing balances of power. Territories that had once been firmly held began to change hands, and familiar routes of connection were reshaped. And yet, even within this shifting landscape, exchange did not cease. Trade continued, ideas moved across boundaries, and interactions between these worlds, though sometimes marked by conflict, also carried moments of adaptation and learning. As I reflect on this period, there is a sense of widening, as if the story, once centered on a single empire, was now expanding outward, encompassing multiple regions, each moving according to its own rhythm, yet increasingly connected in unexpected ways. The Western lands, quieter and more localized, the Eastern Empire, maintaining continuity while adapting, and this rising world, bringing new energy, new belief, and new direction, all existing at the same time, shaping one another through both distance and contact. And in the years that followed, these interactions would continue to unfold, influencing trade, belief, and the balance of power across continents. Yet, even as these larger movements took shape, life within the Western lands remained grounded in the local, shaped by land, by community, and by the need for protection in a world where distant authority could no longer be relied upon. And it was within this need for protection that new forms of leadership and obligation would begin to take shape, slowly forming systems that would define the structure of society for generations to come. As the wider world continued to shift, and new forces began to move across regions once connected by empire, the Western lands were not left empty. Instead, they gradually became home to new kingdoms, each forming in its own way, shaped by both what had been left behind and what was newly arriving. These were not sudden creations, nor were they entirely separate from the past. Rather, they emerged slowly, as groups who had once lived at the edges of Roman territory began to settle more permanently within it, adapting to landscapes that still carried the imprint of an older order. A small gathering inside a village church, lit only by soft, uneven light, might feel unchanged, even as the wider world beyond it continued to shift. Among these groups were the Goths, who established themselves in regions that had once been central to Roman administration. In the west, they formed a kingdom that stretched across parts of what is now Spain and southern Gaul, where Roman cities still stood, though their roles were changing. In these places, life continued within familiar structures, yet under new leadership. Roman law did not disappear entirely, and in many cases it existed alongside the customs of those who now governed, creating systems that reflected both continuity and change. Though for those living within these communities, it did not yet feel like a transformation, but rather a continuation of what they already knew. Further east, another Gothic kingdom took shape in Italy, where a ruler known as Theodoric sought to maintain a balance between the traditions of Rome and the authority of his own people. Under his guidance, administrative systems were preserved, and efforts were made to ensure that different communities could exist within a shared framework. In this way, the past was not erased, but carefully adapted, allowing elements of Roman organization to remain, even as power had shifted into new hands. Elsewhere, the Vandals established their rule across North Africa, controlling territories that had once been vital to the supply of grain for the empire. From these lands, they governed both coastal cities and inland regions, shaping a kingdom that connected the Mediterranean world in new ways. And in the northern regions of Gaul, the Franks began to expand their influence, moving gradually from smaller groups into a more unified presence, guided by leaders who understood both the opportunities and the challenges of a changing landscape. What is striking in this period is not simply the emergence of these kingdoms, but the way in which they adapted to what they inherited. Rather than rebuilding entirely from the ground up, they often worked within existing systems, modifying them to suit new conditions. Cities were still used, roads still connected regions, and administrative ideas continued to influence how authority was exercised. Yet everything was adjusted, reshaped, and made to fit a world that no longer had a single center of power. At the same time, identity itself was becoming more fluid. The distinction between Roman and non-Roman, once clearly defined, began to soften. People lived within mixed communities, spoke evolving languages, and followed systems that drew from multiple traditions. As I reflect on this transformation, there is something gradual and almost organic in the way these kingdoms formed. Not through a single moment of creation, but through a process of settling, adapting, and redefining what it meant to belong within a particular place. For those living within these regions, life was not experienced as the rise of something new, but as a continuation, shaped by new leaders, new customs, and new expectations, yet still grounded in familiar surroundings. And over time, these kingdoms would begin to strengthen, forming structures of loyalty, developing systems of rule, and establishing identities that would influence the course of European history for generations. Yet, even as these early kingdoms took shape, one of them was beginning to grow in a way that would set it apart. not immediately, but gradually, through decisions that would connect belief, leadership, and power in a lasting way. And in the years that followed, this kingdom, guided by a single ruler, would begin to move in a direction that would reshape the relationship between faith and authority across the Western world. As these early kingdoms continued to take shape, and life settled into patterns that blended the old with the new, one among them began to move in a direction that would carry lasting significance, not through sudden conquest alone, but through a decision that would quietly reshape the balance between belief and power. In the lands of Gaul, where Roman influence still lingered in cities and roads, the Franks were gradually consolidating their position, bringing together smaller groups under a single leadership that was beginning to extend its reach more consistently across the region. A traveler moving between distant cities might hear different languages within the same day, each one carrying its own rhythm, its own way of seeing the world. At the center of this process was a figure known as Clovis, a ruler whose authority grew not only through expansion, but through his ability to recognize the importance of alignment in a world where different systems were still finding their place. Under his leadership, the Frankish kingdom expanded its influence across much of Gaul, moving into territories that had once been held by other groups and gradually establishing a more unified presence. Yet, what set this moment apart was not only the growth of territory, but the direction in which that growth was guided. Yet these connections were not always fully understood, at least not by those who experienced them first. At a time when belief itself was still varied, and different interpretations of Christianity existed alongside older traditions, Clovis made a decision that would shape both his rule and the future of his kingdom. He chose to adopt the form of Christianity that was supported by the Church in Rome, aligning himself not only with a belief system, but with a network of influence that extended beyond his immediate domain. This decision did not occur in isolation. It was influenced by relationships, by counsel, and by the recognition that unity in belief could support unity in rule. And in choosing this path, Clovis distinguished himself from other rulers whose religious affiliations placed them at a distance from the broader population of the region. For many living within these lands, this alignment created a sense of continuity, connecting the emerging Frankish authority with traditions that had already taken root within local communities. And in doing so, he had helped bridge the space between Roman past and evolving present. The relationship between the king and the church grew gradually, shaped by mutual benefit. The church gained a protector and supporter, while the king gained legitimacy, guidance, and a framework that extended beyond immediate power. And through this relationship, new patterns began to form, where leadership was not defined solely by strength or territory, but also by connection to a wider system of belief and meaning. Over time, this alignment would influence how authority was understood, not only as something exercised, but as something recognized and supported by those who shared in a common identity. As I reflect on this moment, there is something subtle yet profound in the way a single decision could shape the course of an entire region, not through force alone, but through the quiet merging of systems that, together, created a stronger foundation. And in the years that followed, the Frankish kingdom would continue to grow, building upon this alignment, strengthening its structures, and gradually becoming one of the most influential powers in the Western world. Yet this growth would not unfold without challenge. Beyond its borders, new pressures continued to rise, and within its expanding territories, the need for organization, defense, and cohesion became increasingly important. And as these demands grew, another figure would emerge, one whose role would not be that of a king, but whose influence would shape the direction of this kingdom in ways that would reach far beyond his own time. As the Frankish kingdom continued to grow, strengthened by its alignment with belief and its expanding influence across the lands of Gaul, new pressures began to gather beyond its borders. Not all at once, and not always clearly defined, but steadily enough to be felt in the shifting balance of the wider world. To the south, across regions that had once been firmly connected to both Roman and later Gothic control, a different kind of expansion was unfolding, one that moved across North Africa and into the Iberian Peninsula, bringing with it new leadership, new structures, and a growing presence that would gradually approach the frontiers of Frankish territory. In a quiet hall, where decisions were made without ceremony, the future of entire regions might begin to change, without anyone present fully realizing it. For those living in the northern lands, these movements were not always immediately understood. News traveled slowly, often carried through fragmented reports and distant accounts. Yet, over time, it became clear that the boundaries of influence were changing, and that the stability which had begun to form would soon be tested. Within the Frankish realm itself, authority had also begun to shift in subtle ways. While kings remained symbols of leadership, much of the practical power was increasingly exercised by figures who operated behind the formal structure of rule. Among them, one name would come to stand out over time, though, at the time, this shift in leadership may not have seemed as significant as it would later become. Charles, later known as Charles Martel, did not begin as a king, but as a leader whose influence grew through responsibility, organization, and the ability to respond to the needs of a changing landscape. His position placed him at the center of decisions that required both caution and strength. As pressures from the south continued to move closer, what had once been distant concerns gradually became immediate, and the need for coordination, for defense, and for a unified response became more apparent. The moment often remembered in connection with this period is a confrontation that took place near the region of Tours. Not as a sudden or isolated event, but as part of a broader pattern of encounters between expanding forces and established territories. Details of the encounter would later be told in many ways. Yet, what remains consistent is the understanding that this moment marked a point at which the direction of expansion shifted, where movement slowed, and where the balance between regions was, at least for a time, stabilized. For those who experienced it, the event was likely one of many challenges faced during an era of uncertainty. Not a singular turning point, but part of an ongoing effort to maintain cohesion within a world that was still adjusting to new realities. And yet, over time, this moment came to be remembered as something more, as a symbol of resistance, of preservation, and of the ability of emerging powers to define their own boundaries. Charles himself would not take the title of king, but his influence would shape the future of the Frankish realm in lasting ways, strengthening its structure, organizing its defenses, and laying the groundwork for what would follow in the generations ahead. As I reflect on this period, there is a sense that history often gathers around certain moments, giving them weight and meaning. Yet, beneath that, there are always the steady processes that make such moments possible: preparation, adaptation, and the gradual building of capacity. And in this case, it was not only the event itself, but the conditions surrounding it that shaped its importance. A world in transition, a kingdom finding its strength, and a leader whose role would extend beyond his own lifetime. In the years that followed, the influence of Charles Martel would continue to be felt, not only through the stability he helped maintain, but through the path he opened for those who would come after him. And among them would be a figure who would take what had been built and extend it further, not only consolidating power, but reshaping the very idea of empire in the Western world. And as this new phase began to take form, the story of the Franks was about to move into a period of expansion, ambition, and transformation that would reach far beyond its original boundaries. As the influence of Charles Martel continued to shape the direction of the Frankish realm, the structure of power itself was beginning to shift in ways that were not immediately visible, yet deeply significant. Not through sudden change, but through a gradual redefinition of where authority truly resided. For many years, the title of king had remained in place, carrying with it the memory of earlier leadership. Yet, in practice, much of the responsibility for governing, organizing, and defending the realm had come to rest in the hands of those who operated alongside the throne, rather than upon it. A soldier, standing at the edge of an open field, might only notice the stillness before movement, not yet aware of how that moment would be remembered. This quiet separation between title and power did not emerge overnight. It developed slowly, shaped by necessity, by circumstance, and by the ability of certain individuals to respond effectively to the challenges of their time. Among those who inherited this evolving role was Pepin, the son of Charles Martel, a figure who would come to recognize that the balance between symbolic authority and practical control could not remain divided indefinitely, yet even this moment would come to be understood differently in the years that followed. As he stepped into his position, the question was not simply how to lead, but how to align what was already true in practice with what was recognized in name, a question that required not only strength, but also careful consideration of legitimacy, tradition, and support. At this time, the relationship between the Frankish leadership and the Church had already begun to take shape, forming a connection that extended beyond immediate concerns, one that offered both guidance and recognition, and that carried influence across regions where political authority alone might not reach. Pepin understood that this relationship could provide something essential, a way to transform practical authority into acknowledged rule, not through force alone, but through alignment with a system that held meaning for those who lived within it. And so, rather than acting unilaterally, he sought confirmation, engaging with the leadership of the Church to ask a question that was as much philosophical as it was political. Who should truly be called king? The one who holds the title, or the one who exercises the power? The answer, once given, would quietly reshape the structure of leadership, and with it, the direction of the Frankish realm itself. In time, Pepin was recognized as king, not through a dramatic overthrow, but through a transition that reflected what had already become reality. The title and the power were brought together, aligning form with function, and establishing a new foundation for governance. This moment did not feel like a rupture. It was instead a continuation, a refinement of what had already been unfolding over years. Yet its implications would extend far beyond the immediate change, influencing how authority would be understood in the generations that followed. At the same time, this alignment strengthened the bond between the Frankish rulers and the Church, creating a partnership that would shape not only internal governance, but also the broader political landscape of the Western world. In the years that followed, this relationship would be expressed not only in shared support, but in action, as the Frankish kingdom extended its influence into regions where the Church faced challenges, offering protection while also reinforcing its own position. As I reflect on this transition, there is a sense of quiet precision in the way power was redefined, not seized in a moment of upheaval, but carefully repositioned, supported by recognition, and integrated into a structure that felt both stable and legitimate. And through this process, a new order began to take shape, one that would carry forward the legacy of what had come before, while also preparing the ground for something larger, something that would once again extend across wide regions, though in a form different from the empire that had preceded it. Yet even as this new foundation was established, its full potential had not yet been realized. It would require another figure, one who would build upon this alignment, expand its reach, and give it a form that would be remembered for centuries. And in the years that followed, that figure would begin to emerge, gradually, step by step, shaping a realm that would come to be seen not simply as a kingdom, but as something far greater. As this new foundation of power continued to settle into place, and the alignment between leadership and belief grew more firmly established, the stage was gradually being prepared for a figure whose influence would extend far beyond the boundaries of a single kingdom. Charlemagne, the son of Pepin, did not begin as a ruler set apart from others. Yet, over time, his presence would come to shape the direction of the Frankish realm in ways that reflected both continuity and ambition, drawing together the elements that had been forming across generations. There may have been mornings when Charlemagne sat in quiet discussion, maps spread across a table, each line representing places he would never personally see. When he came into power, the kingdom he inherited was already strong, yet not fully unified. Its territories stretched across regions that varied in custom, language, and loyalty, requiring not only authority but careful coordination to hold together. Rather than seeking immediate transformation, his early years were marked by steady movement, campaigns that extended the reach of his influence, not always through rapid conquest, but through a series of efforts that gradually brought surrounding regions into closer alignment with his rule, though for him, these decisions were simply part of the work of each day. To the south, his attention turned toward lands that had long held strategic importance, where connections between regions could either support or disrupt stability. To the east, areas that remained outside the influence of the Frankish world became the focus of prolonged engagement, shaped by both resistance and persistence. These efforts were not defined by a single moment, but by continuity. Years of movement, adjustment, and reinforcement, through which the boundaries of the realm expanded, not suddenly, but through accumulation. And as this expansion unfolded, the nature of leadership itself began to evolve. Governing such a wide territory required systems that could extend beyond the immediate presence of the ruler, reaching into distant regions while maintaining a sense of cohesion. Local leaders were entrusted with responsibilities, acting not independently, but as extensions of a broader structure. And through this arrangement, a network began to form, one that connected distant areas through shared expectations, communication, and accountability. At the same time, the relationship with the Church continued to play an important role, not only as a source of legitimacy, but as a partner in shaping the cultural and intellectual direction of the realm. Monasteries, schools, and centers of learning began to receive greater attention, forming part of a wider effort to strengthen the foundations of society. As I reflect on this period, there is a sense that expansion was not only about land, but about integration, bringing together regions that had once been separate, and creating connections that allowed them to function as part of a larger whole. For those living within these territories, the changes would have been gradual. New authorities appearing, new expectations forming, yet much of daily life continuing as before, shaped by land, by community, and by routines that remained familiar. And yet, beneath that continuity, something larger was taking shape. A realm that was no longer simply one among many, but one that was beginning to stand apart in both scale and organization. Over time, this growing structure would come to be seen not only as a kingdom, but as something that carried echoes of an earlier idea, the idea of empire, not in its original form, but in a way adapted to the realities of a new age. And in the years that followed, this idea would be given a visible form, through an event that would bring together leadership, belief, and tradition in a way that symbolized both continuity and transformation. Yet, even before that moment, the foundations had already been laid through steady expansion, careful organization, and the gradual shaping of a realm that could sustain something larger than itself. And as this process continued, the world was moving toward a moment where the memory of Rome would meet the realities of a new power, and where a title long associated with the past would once again be spoken, though in a form that reflected the time in which it returned. As the realm of Charlemagne continued to expand and settle into a structure that reached across regions once divided, the idea of what this growing power represented was beginning to take on a deeper meaning. Not only as a kingdom, but as something that seemed to echo a past that had not entirely disappeared. For generations, the memory of Rome had remained present, in language, in law, in the quiet persistence of institutions that had adapted rather than vanished. Yet the title that once stood at the center of that world, the title of emperor, had not been carried in the Western lands for many years. Messengers moving between regions, carrying information that would take days to arrive, reminded everyone how far distance still truly was. And now, as the influence of Charlemagne extended across much of Western Europe, the possibility of restoring that title, not in its original form, but in a way suited to the present, began to emerge, not as an inevitability, but as a convergence of conditions that made such a moment possible. The relationship between Charlemagne and the Church had grown steadily stronger, built on mutual support, a shared purpose, and a recognition that stability could be reinforced through alignment between leadership and belief. Yet structures such as these rarely feel complete, even when they appear strong from a distance. At the same time, the city of Rome itself, though no longer the center of empire as it once had been, still held symbolic weight. Its traditions, its authority, and its connection to earlier centuries remained powerful, even in a world that had changed. It was within this setting that an event took place, one that would later be remembered not for its suddenness, but for its meaning. On a winter day during a gathering marked by ceremony and tradition, Charlemagne was given a title that had not been used in the West for generations. Crowned as emperor, he stood at a point where past and present seemed to meet, not as a continuation of the Roman Empire in its original form, but as a reimagining of its idea, adapted to the realities of a different time. For those who witnessed it, the moment may have felt both familiar and new, a recognition of authority that carried echoes of history, yet belonged to a world that had moved beyond the structures that once defined it. And yet, this act was not without complexity. In the Eastern Empire, and where the legacy of Rome had continued without interruption, the emergence of another emperor in the West introduced a new dynamic, one that reflected both shared heritage and growing separation. In the West, however, the coronation carried a different significance. It represented the consolidation of power, the strengthening of identity, and the suggestion that a new form of unity could exist, even in a landscape shaped by fragmentation. As I reflect on this moment, there is a sense that it was less about restoring what had been lost, and more about redefining what could be, drawing from memory, but not confined by it, and shaping something that could exist within the conditions of its time. For Charlemagne himself, the title did not change the daily responsibilities of leadership, governance, coordination, and the management of a vast realm continued as before. Yet it did alter how that leadership was perceived, both within his territories and beyond them. Over time, this perception would influence how authority was understood, linking the idea of empire not only to land and power, but to recognition, legitimacy, and continuity with a past that still held meaning. And in the years that followed, the structure that had been built under Charlemagne would continue to evolve, shaped by successors, challenged by division, and tested by the realities of governing such a wide and varied realm. Yet, even as this imperial vision took form, it remained tied to the stability of a single figure. And as time moved forward, the question of what would happen after him began, quietly, to take shape. And in that question lay the beginning of another transformation, one that would shift the balance once again and lead the Western world into a new phase of uncertainty and change. As the presence of Charlemagne had once brought a sense of cohesion to a vast and varied realm, the years that followed his passing began to reveal a quieter shift. Not an immediate collapse, but a gradual loosening of the structures that had held everything together. The systems he had established did not disappear. They continued for a time to function much as they had before. Local leaders remained in place, communication still moved across regions, and the idea of unity had not yet faded from memory. From the shoreline, long, narrow shapes might emerge through morning mist, silent at first, before slowly drawing closer. And yet, without a single guiding figure at the center, the balance that had once been carefully maintained began to change. Authority, which had flowed outward from one source, now began to settle into multiple centers, each shaped by its own priorities, its own challenges, and its own understanding of what stability required. In the years that followed, leadership passed to the next generation. Yet this transition was not defined by continuity alone, but by division. Responsibilities were shared, territories were distributed, and what had once been a unified realm began to take on a more segmented form. Though to those who first saw them, they may have appeared simply as distant figures on the horizon. This division was not necessarily seen as a breaking apart. Rather, it reflected a way of organizing power that felt practical at the time, allowing different regions to be governed more directly, while still maintaining a sense of shared heritage. But over time, these divisions became more distinct. Boundaries that had once been administrative grew into borders that carried deeper meaning, and the connections between regions, though still present, became less consistent than before. For those living within these lands, the changes would not have appeared as a sudden shift. Life continued much as it always had. Fields were tended, communities remained, and daily routines followed familiar patterns. Yet gradually, the larger framework that connected these lives began to feel more distant. Decisions were made closer to home. Loyalties became more localized, and the idea of belonging to a single, unified realm began to soften. As this process continued, external pressures also began to reappear, not as a single threat, but as a series of movements from different directions, groups traveling, settling, and at times testing the edges of these newly defined territories. Without a central authority strong enough to respond to every challenge, responsibility for protection increasingly shifted to local leaders, those who could organize defense, provide security, and maintain order within their immediate surroundings. In this way, power became more closely tied to land, to the ability to hold it, to protect it, and to sustain those who lived upon it. And from this connection, new forms of relationship began to develop, shaped by necessity and reinforced through practice. As I reflect on this period, there is a sense that fragmentation was not simply a loss, but also a transformation. A movement away from a single expansive structure toward a landscape defined by many smaller, interconnected parts. Each region adapted in its own way, some maintaining stronger links to the past, others evolving more quickly into new forms, yet all contributing to a broader pattern of change that would define the character of the age. And in the years that followed, these patterns would continue to deepen as local authority strengthened, as connections shifted, and as new systems of obligation and protection began to take shape. Yet even within this process of division, the need for stability remained constant, and it was within that need that a new structure, built not on centralized rule, but on personal bonds and shared responsibility, would begin to emerge. And as this structure took form, it would gradually define how power, land, and loyalty were understood in the centuries that followed. As these newly divided lands continued to settle into patterns of local rule, and communities adapted to a world where authority was closer, yet less unified, another movement was beginning far beyond the familiar boundaries of these regions, not immediately visible, but steadily approaching from the northern seas. At first, these movements were not widely understood. Small groups traveling across open water, navigating coastlines and rivers with a familiarity that came from generations of experience. Their journeys shaped not only by necessity, but by knowledge of routes that connected distant shores. Across open land, movement could be seen long before it arrived, giving time to prepare, but not always time to understand. The vessels they used were unlike those commonly seen in the southern lands, long, narrow, and carefully constructed to move both across open sea and along shallow rivers, allowing them to reach places that had once felt protected by distance or geography. In the early encounters, their presence was sudden, appearing along coastlines, near settlements, or beside places of gathering, where activity was visible and defenses were limited. And then, just as quickly, they would depart, returning to the waters from which they had come. Yet, stability, once formed, always carries the question of how long it will last. For those who experience these moments, the sense was not always of a large invasion, but of brief and unexpected disruption. Events that stood apart from the familiar rhythm of life, yet did not immediately suggest a lasting change. And yet, over time, these encounters became more frequent. Patterns began to emerge, and what had once seemed isolated gradually revealed itself as part of a wider movement, one that would continue to unfold across many regions. The communities most affected were often those least prepared: coastal settlements, trading points, and places where resources were gathered and stored, locations that had developed during more stable times, and which now found themselves exposed in new ways. Without strong centralized protection, responses were local. Communities adapted as best they could, reinforcing what they had, adjusting where they lived, and learning, slowly, to recognize the signs of approach. In some areas, these encounters remained brief. In others, they began to extend. Groups returned to the same regions, not only to pass through, but to remain for longer periods, gradually shifting from movement to presence. As this continued, the distinction between visitor and settler began to change. What had once been temporary became more lasting, and new communities began to form alongside those that already existed. These developments did not occur in a single direction. They unfolded across different regions, each shaped by its own geography, its own responses, and its own pace of adaptation. As I reflect on this period, there is a sense of quiet unpredictability, not of overwhelming force, but of repeated encounters that gradually altered expectations, a reshaping how communities understood distance, safety, and connection. For those living within these lands, the world was becoming less certain once again, not in the same way as before, but through a new pattern of movement that brought distant regions into sudden contact. And in response to this uncertainty, the need for protection became more immediate, not as an abstract concern, but as something woven into daily life, influencing where people lived, how they organized themselves, and whom they chose to trust. Over time, this need would deepen, leading to the strengthening of the local defenses, the building of structures designed for security, and the formation of relationships based on protection and obligation. Yet, even as these responses began to take shape, the movements from the north continued, adapting, expanding, and gradually becoming part of the landscape they had once approached from afar. And in the years that followed, these encounters would no longer be brief interruptions, but ongoing presences, shaping not only the edges of these lands but their internal structures as well. And it was within this growing need for security that a new system built on land, loyalty, and mutual obligation would begin to emerge more clearly, defining how people would live, work, and protect one another in the centuries ahead. As these movements from the northern seas continued, and what had once been brief encounters began to repeat with growing familiarity, something gradual began to change, not only in how these travelers approached the lands to the south, but in how they began to relate to them. What had first appeared as moments of sudden arrival, followed by swift departure, slowly took on a different pattern. In certain regions, groups began to remain for longer periods, returning not just once, but again and again, until the line between passing through and staying began to soften. In a modest room, lit by firelight, plans might be shaped quietly, far from the places where they would unfold. In these places, the land itself began to play a different role, no longer simply a destination for movement, but a place where life could be established, where fields could be worked, and where communities could begin to take shape alongside those that already existed. This transition did not happen everywhere at the same pace. In some areas, contact remained occasional, while in others, it deepened into something more sustained, shaped by local conditions, by opportunity, and by the responses of those who lived there, though leadership is often felt most clearly in the smallest decisions. Along river systems especially, movement extended further inland. Routes that had once carried trade now carried new groups into regions that had not expected such contact. And through these waterways, connections formed that linked distant places in ways that had not been common before. Over time, the presence of these northern groups became more familiar, not as something entirely separate, but as part of a changing landscape, where interaction, adaptation, and coexistence began to emerge, sometimes gradually, sometimes unevenly. In certain regions, agreements were reached, land was granted, authority was recognized, and what had once been unpredictable encounters took on a more structured form, allowing for stability to develop where uncertainty had once been dominant. One such development occurred along the western coasts of what is now France, where a leader from the north was given land in exchange for protection. And from this arrangement, a new region began to form, shaped by both its origins and its surroundings. In these evolving communities, customs blended over time. Language, law, and daily practice adapted to reflect the mixture of traditions that now shared the same space. And identities that had once been distinct became more fluid, shaped by experience rather than origin alone. For those living within these regions, life continued to follow familiar rhythms. Fields were tended, families grew, and communities organized themselves around both necessity and opportunity. Yet beneath that continuity, something new had taken root, something that reflected a broader pattern of change. As I reflect on this transformation, there is a sense that what began as movement gradually became presence, and what was once uncertain became, over time, part of the structure of everyday life. These settlements did not erase what had come before. Instead, they added to it, creating layers of history that coexisted within the same spaces, each contributing to the shape of the world that was slowly emerging. And in the years that followed, these blended communities would continue to develop, influencing not only local regions, but also the wider patterns of connection across the continent. Yet, even as these changes took place, pressures from other directions continued to unfold. Movements from the east, swift and unfamiliar, would soon bring a different kind of challenge, one that would test the adaptability of these lands once again. And as these new forces began to approach, the need for structure, for protection, and for clearly defined relationships would become even more important. And it was within this growing need that the foundations of a system built on land, loyalty, and mutual obligation would begin to take clearer form, shaping the way people understood power, protection, and belonging in the generations to come. As these Western lands continued to adjust to the movements from the north, and as communities slowly learned to live alongside new arrivals, another presence was beginning to emerge from a very different direction. Not from the seas, but from the wide open plains to the east, where movement followed a rhythm shaped by distance, speed, and the quiet mastery of the land. At first, this presence was only faintly understood, carried through distant reports, scattered encounters, and the gradual awareness that something unfamiliar was approaching. Not with the same patterns as before, but with a different kind of motion, one that was less predictable and more difficult to anticipate. A farmer, standing at the edge of a field, might measure his world not in distance, but in the land he could see, and the work it required each day. These were groups who traveled on horseback, moving across vast stretches of land with a fluidity that allowed them to appear quickly and disappear just as easily. Their knowledge of terrain, their coordination, and their ability to travel light gave them an advantage in a world where most communities were rooted in place. For those who encountered them, the experience was often brief, yet unsettling. Not because of overwhelming force alone, but because of the speed at which these movements occurred, leaving little time to prepare, and even less time to respond. Yet within this structure, each person experienced it in a different way. And as with the earlier movements from the north, these encounters did not remain isolated. Over time, they became more frequent, extending across regions that had already begun to adapt to a world of shifting boundaries. In this way, the lands of Central and Western Europe found themselves facing pressures from multiple directions, each different in form, yet similar in the uncertainty they introduced. And within this environment, the need for protection became not only practical, but constant. Communities responded as they could, strengthening local defenses, organizing around those who could offer protection, and gradually reshaping their expectations of what stability meant in a world where distance no longer guaranteed safety. In some regions, leaders emerged who were able to coordinate more effective responses, bringing together groups, organizing resistance, and creating moments of stability within a broader pattern of uncertainty. Over time, these efforts began to shift the balance, not by removing the presence of these Eastern riders entirely, but by changing the conditions under which they moved, making encounters less frequent, less unpredictable, and more contained. One such moment, remembered in later accounts, marked a point at which this shifting balance became more visible, where coordinated defense began to hold, and where the movement that had once seemed unstoppable began to slow. And yet, as I reflect on this period, it is not only the events themselves that stand out, but the way they shaped the responses of those who lived through them. The gradual realization that protection could no longer be distant or assumed, but had to be organized, maintained, and closely tied to the land itself. For many, this meant placing trust in those who could provide that protection. Individuals who controlled resources, who could gather support, and who could respond when needed. And through this trust, new forms of relationship began to take shape. These relationships were not defined by abstract authority, but by mutual obligation, land in exchange for service, protection in exchange for loyalty. Arrangements that grew not from theory, but from the practical realities of a world that required constant adaptation. As these patterns continued to develop, they began to form the outlines of a system that would become more clearly defined in the years that followed. One that would connect people through personal bonds, structured responsibilities, and a shared need for security. And in this way, what had begun as a response to movement and uncertainty gradually became a foundation, shaping how communities organized themselves, how power was distributed, and how stability was understood in an age that had moved far from the centralized structures of the past. And as this system continued to take form, it would begin to define not only how people protected themselves, but how they lived, worked, and related to one another across generations. As these pressures from different directions continued to shape the experience of daily life, and as communities adjusted to a world where uncertainty had become familiar, a new pattern of organization began to emerge, not through formal design, but through repeated necessity, gradually forming a system that would define relationships for generations. In a landscape where distant authority could no longer provide consistent protection, the need for security became immediate and personal. And in response, individuals began to look not toward a central power, but toward those nearby who could offer stability, resources, and defense. Morning would arrive without announcement, light spreading slowly across the land, marking the beginning of another day. Much like the one before, land, in this context, became more than a place of living. It became the foundation of both survival and authority. Those who controlled land were able to support others, to organize protection, and to establish a position from which influence could grow. And from this connection between land and protection, relationships began to take shape, not as abstract agreements, but as lived arrangements built on mutual need, where one offered service and the other offered security, creating bonds that were both practical and enduring. Though routines such as these rarely feel like systems to those living within them. These bonds were often personal, formed through direct commitment, reinforced by trust, and maintained through ongoing responsibility. And while they varied from place to place, their underlying structure carried a similar rhythm, one that connected people through obligation and expectation. For those who entered into such relationships, the exchange was clear. Protection in times of uncertainty, in return for loyalty, service, and support, a balance that reflected the realities of a world where safety could not be assumed, but had to be sustained. Over time, these arrangements became more structured. Ceremonies, symbols, and shared understandings developed, giving form to what had once been informal. And through this process, the bonds themselves became recognized as part of a broader system. At the same time, layers began to form within this structure. Those who received land and protection could, in turn, extend similar arrangements to others, creating networks that connected individuals across different levels, each linked through a chain of responsibility. In this way, what began as local adaptation gradually became a defining feature of society, shaping not only how power was distributed, but how people understood their place within the world around them. For many, daily life remained grounded in familiar routines, tending fields, maintaining homes, and participating in the rhythms of community. Yet these activities now existed within a framework that connected them to larger systems of protection and obligation. As I reflect on this development, there is something deeply human in its formation, not the result of distant planning, but of countless decisions made in response to immediate needs, each one small on its own, yet together forming a structure that would endure. And over time, this structure would come to define the organization of society, influencing how land was held, how authority was exercised, and how relationships were understood across regions that had once been unified under a very different system. Yet, even as these bonds provided stability, they also introduced new complexities. dependencies that required balance, expectations that needed to be maintained, and relationships that could shift if trust was broken or conditions changed. And in the years that followed, these complexities would deepen as the system became more established, more layered, and more central to the way life was lived. And as this happened, another element would begin to rise alongside it, one that would give physical form to these bonds, shaping the landscape itself in ways that reflected the need for protection, authority, and presence within a changing world. As these bonds of land and loyalty continued to take root, and as relationships of protection and service became more clearly defined, the landscape itself began to change, not suddenly, but gradually, shaped by the need to make these arrangements visible, stable, and enduring. Across hills, near rivers, and along the edges of settled land, new structures began to rise. At first simple, built from earth and timber, positioned carefully to observe the surrounding terrain. And over time, these structures grew more complex, more durable, and more central to the organization of power. A road, once quiet, might begin to see more movement, not enough to stand out, but enough to suggest change. These were the early castles, not only places of defense, but also centers from which authority was expressed, where leadership was made present, and where the bonds that connected people to land and protection could be maintained. Their placement was rarely accidental. They stood where they could oversee movement, where they could offer security to nearby communities, and where they could serve as points of gathering in times of need, their presence shaping both the physical and social landscape around them. Yet within this steady pattern, something new was already beginning to form. For those who lived nearby, the castle was not a distant symbol. It was part of daily life, a place where decisions were made, where obligations were fulfilled, and where protection could be sought when uncertainty returned. Within these structures, life followed its own rhythm. Those who served within them carried out tasks that ranged from maintaining defenses to managing resources. And through this work, the castle became not only a place of strength, but also of coordination and continuity. At the same time, these spaces reflected the layered nature of the society that had formed. Those who held authority lived alongside those who supported it. Each role connected through the same system of obligation that extended outward into the surrounding lands. Over time, as techniques improved and resources allowed, these structures were rebuilt in stone, their forms becoming more permanent, their presence more enduring, and their influence more deeply embedded in the regions they served. And with this permanence came a different kind of stability, one that could be seen, touched, and relied upon, offering reassurance in a world where uncertainty had once been more difficult to contain. Yet even as these castles provided protection, they also marked the boundaries of power, defining who held authority within a given region and where that authority began and ended, creating a landscape that was both organized and divided. As I reflect on this transformation, there is something striking in the way power became visible, no longer centered in distant institutions but expressed through structures that stood within reach, shaping the experience of everyday life. For many, the presence of a castle meant safety, a place to turn in times of danger, a center of support in moments of need. Yet it also meant obligation, a reminder of the relationships that connected land, service, and authority. And in the years that followed, these structures would continue to multiply, forming a network across the landscape, each one linked to the system that had brought it into being, each one reinforcing the patterns of life that defined the age. Yet within these walls, another world also existed, one shaped not only by defense and authority, but by daily routines, relationships, and experiences that reflected both the privileges and the responsibilities of those who lived there. And as this life unfolded within and around these structures, the story of this age would begin to move beyond power alone, turning toward the people who lived within it, and the ways in which their lives were shaped by the systems that surrounded them. As these structures of stone and timber continued to rise across the landscape, and as castles became centers of authority, protection, and coordination, life within their walls began to take on its own rhythm, one shaped not only by responsibility but by routine, expectation, and the quiet patterns of daily existence. For those who lived within these spaces as part of the noble household, life was neither entirely removed from the world outside nor fully defined by it. Instead, it existed in a balance between oversight and participation, where the management of land and people formed the foundation of their role. A farmer, standing at the edge of newly divided fields, might notice how the land now stretched differently, not wider, but more carefully arranged, as if each part had been given a clearer purpose. Each day unfolded through a series of responsibilities, meetings, decisions, and the careful attention to matters that affected both the household and the surrounding lands. Yet these responsibilities were often interwoven with moments of stillness, where time moved more slowly, shaped by the rhythms of the seasons rather than the urgency of distant events. The great hall stood at the center of this life, a space where people gathered, where meals were shared, and where discussions took place, its presence reflecting both the authority of those who lived there and the community that formed around it. There may have been moments when he paused, looking across the work that would shape the coming season, not as part of a system, but simply as the rhythm of his life. Within this environment, relationships were essential, not only between those of similar rank, but across the layers of the household, each role connected, each responsibility contributing to the functioning of the whole. Hospitality, too, played an important part. Travelers, messengers, and visitors passed through these spaces, bringing with them news, stories, and connections to a wider world that, though distant, was never entirely absent. Education and learning, though different from what would come later, were present in their own forms. Knowledge was passed through conversation, through observation, and through the guidance of those who had experience in governance, in tradition, and in the expectations of their position. At the same time, life within the castle was not without its limitations. Movement was often confined, routines could become repetitive, and the responsibilities of maintaining authority required constant attention. Yet, within these constraints, people created patterns that brought both structure and familiarity. As I reflect on this way of life, there is a sense of quiet continuity. A world that moved at its own pace, shaped by obligation, yet softened by routine, where the passage of time was marked not by sudden change, but by gradual repetition. For many within these households, the identity was closely tied to role, to the expectations that came with position, and to the relationships that defined their place within the wider structure of society. And beyond the walls, the lands that supported this life continued to function. Fields were worked, resources gathered, and communities sustained, all connected, directly or indirectly, to the presence of the castle and those who lived within it. Yet, even as this life carried a sense of stability, it remained connected to the larger system of obligation, one that required readiness, that depended on loyalty, and that could shift if circumstances changed. And in the years that followed, this balance between stability and responsibility would continue to shape the experience of those within these walls, influencing not only how they lived, but how they understood their place within a world defined by land, power, and connection. And as this presence expanded, its influence would begin to reach far beyond these walls. And as this perspective deepened, the focus of life in this age would begin to turn outward as well, toward those who lived beyond the walls, whose lives, though different in form, were just as central to the structure that held everything together. As life within the castles continued with its own patterns of responsibility and routine, the greater part of the population lived beyond those walls, in villages and scattered homes, where daily existence was shaped not by authority alone, but by the land itself, and by the quiet demands of each passing season. Here, and the rhythm of life followed a different measure, not marked by gatherings in great halls or the movement of messengers, but by the rising of the sun, the changing of the weather, and the steady cycle of work that returned again and again, year after year. The market was not loud, but constant, with goods passing from one hand to another, in a rhythm that felt almost unbroken. Fields stretched outward from each settlement, divided into strips that families tended with care, and within these spaces, time was understood through action, plowing, planting, tending, and harvesting, each task arriving in its own moment, each one necessary to the continuation of life. The work was rarely hurried, yet it was constant, shaped by repetition rather than urgency, and though each day resembled the one before it, there was a quiet awareness that each season carried its own challenges, its own uncertainties, and its own hopes. A merchant, arriving just before dusk, might notice that the journey felt shorter than before, not because the distance had changed, but because the connections between places had grown stronger. Homes were modest, built from materials gathered nearby, wood, earth, and thatch, structures that offered shelter, yet remained closely connected to the environment around them, where the boundary between inside and outside was often less defined than in the castles above. Within these homes, life unfolded in small, familiar ways. Meals prepared from what could be grown or gathered, tools maintained through careful use, and knowledge passed from one generation to the next through observation and practice. Community played an essential role, not through formal systems, but through shared experience. Neighbors worked alongside one another, supported each other during times of need, and participated together in the rhythms that defined the year. And while obligations to local lords formed part of this life, they were often woven into the broader pattern of existence, not separate from daily work, but part of it. A reminder of the connections that linked village and castle, land and authority. There was, within this way of living, a balance that was both stable and uncertain. Stable in its repetition, in the familiarity of tasks, in the continuity of community, yet uncertain in its dependence on conditions beyond control. The weather, the harvest, and the small variations that could shape the outcome of an entire year. As I reflect on this life, there is something deeply steady in its rhythm. A world that moved not in sudden changes, but in gradual cycles, where time passed through repetition, and where meaning was found not in moments of transformation, but in the quiet persistence of daily work. For many, this way of life was not seen as limited, but as complete, defined by what was necessary, by what was known, and by the connections that held the community together. And yet, even within this stability, there were changes unfolding. Small adjustments, new tools, new methods, and new ideas that would, over time, begin to shape the productivity of the land and the experience of those who worked upon it. These changes did not arrive all at once. They emerged gradually, carried through practice, through observation, and through the shared knowledge of those who lived closest to the land. And in the years that followed, these developments would begin to transform not only how the land was worked, but how society itself was structured, opening the way for growth, movement, and connections that extended beyond the boundaries of the village. And in this quiet exchange, something larger was beginning to take shape. And as this transformation began to take form, the quiet rhythm of the fields would give rise to a new phase of life, one that would bring expansion, exchange, and a widening of the world that had once seemed contained within the horizon of the land itself. As the rhythms of village life continued, shaped by seasons, labor, and the quiet repetition of daily tasks, small changes began to appear, not as sudden innovations, but as gradual adjustments carried forward through experience, observation, and the shared knowledge of those who worked the land. At first, these changes were almost unnoticeable. Slight differences in how fields were organized, how tools were used, and how time was divided between different kinds of work. Yet, over time, these small shifts began to gather, forming patterns that would slowly transform the productivity of the land itself. Ships resting along the edge of a harbor, rocking gently with the movement of the water, carried more than goods. They carried connection. One such change involved the way fields were rotated. Rather than leaving land unused for long periods, new methods allowed for more consistent cultivation, balancing rest and use in ways that supported both soil and harvest. And through this approach, the land began to yield more reliably than before. Tools, too, evolved, shaped by need, refined through use. Plows became better suited to heavier soils, and harnessing methods improved, allowing animals to work more effectively alongside those who guided them. And with these developments, the effort required to work, the land began to change in subtle but meaningful ways. A young trader watching these arrivals might not yet understand the scale of what was forming, only that each journey seemed to bring something new. As these practices spread, not through formal instruction, but through observation and imitation, communities began to see the effects. Harvests became more stable, surpluses more possible, and the margin between scarcity and sufficiency began, slowly, to widen. This did not mean that uncertainty disappeared. Seasons still varied, weather still influenced outcomes, and challenges remained a constant part of life. Yet there was a growing sense that the land, when worked with care and knowledge, could offer more than it had before. With this increased stability came new possibilities. Populations began to grow, not rapidly, but steadily. Villages expanded, new settlements appeared, and the boundaries of cultivated land gradually extended outward into areas that had once remained untouched. As this happened, the relationship between people and land deepened, not only as a source of survival, but as a foundation for change, where improvements in one area could influence many others, creating connections that extended beyond the immediate needs of daily life. At the same time, these developments did not occur in isolation. They were supported by the structures that had already formed, the bonds of land and loyalty, the protection offered by local authority, and the stability that allowed communities to focus on long-term improvement rather than immediate survival. As I reflect on this transformation, there is something quietly remarkable in its pace, not driven by sudden discovery but by accumulation. Small changes, repeated and refined, until they became part of the way life was lived. For those who experienced it, the change may not have felt dramatic, each season resembling the one before, each task familiar. Yet, over time, the results became visible. More food, more people, and a growing sense that the world was beginning to open outward. And with this opening came new forms of connection, as surplus allowed for exchange, and as communities began to look beyond their immediate surroundings, not only to sustain themselves, but to participate in something larger. These early movements of exchange were modest at first. Goods traded between nearby settlements, relationships formed across short distances, yet within them lay the beginnings of networks that would continue to expand in the years ahead. And as these networks grew, the quiet world of the village would begin to connect with something more dynamic, a world of movement, of trade, and of interaction that would gradually reshape how people understood distance, opportunity, and possibility. And as these journeys continued, they would begin to reshape how distance itself was understood. And in the years that followed, these connections would become more defined, more structured, and more central to the experience of life, leading to the emergence of routes, markets, and exchanges that would link regions in ways not seen since earlier times. As the land began to offer more than it once had, and as communities found themselves with small surpluses that extended beyond immediate need, new patterns of movement slowly began to take shape. Not as grand networks at first, but as simple exchanges between neighboring places, where goods, ideas, and relationships could pass from one to another. These early movements were modest. A surplus of grain traded for tools, crafted items exchanged for materials, and small journeys made between villages and nearby settlements. Yet, within these exchanges lay the beginnings of something larger, something that would gradually extend beyond local boundaries. Inside a workshop, tools rested in familiar places, each one worn slightly from repeated use, each one part of a craft passed carefully through time. Paths that had once been used only occasionally began to see more regular use. Familiar routes formed between communities, and over time, these routes became part of the rhythm of life, traveled not only for necessity, but for opportunity. As this continued, certain locations began to stand out, places where paths crossed, where movement gathered, and where exchange became more frequent. And in these places, small markets began to form, bringing together people from different areas, each carrying what they had and seeking what they needed. An apprentice, standing nearby, might watch each movement closely, learning not through instruction alone, but through repetition. At first, these gatherings were occasional, tied to seasons, to harvests, and to moments when travel was most practical. Yet gradually, they became more consistent, forming a pattern that connected communities in ways that extended beyond their immediate surroundings. For those who participated, these markets offered more than goods. They offered connection, news from distant places, new ideas, and a sense that the world was larger than the boundaries of any single village. Over time, the scale of these exchanges began to grow, not only in volume, but in distance. Goods moved further, routes extended, and what had once been local became regional, linking areas that had not been closely connected for generations. Rivers played an important role in this expansion, carrying both goods and travelers across long distances, providing pathways that were more efficient than overland routes, and connecting regions in ways that reshaped patterns of movement. At the same time, coastal routes continued to develop, linking settlements along the edges of the land, and creating connections that followed the natural contours of the sea. As I reflect on this process, there is a sense of gradual opening, a world that had once been defined by proximity beginning to expand outward, not suddenly, but through repeated movement, through shared need, and through the quiet accumulation of connections. For many, these changes brought new possibilities: access to goods that had once been distant, opportunities to engage with people beyond their immediate community, and a growing awareness of a wider network that extended beyond familiar horizons. And yet, with this expansion came new considerations: the need for trust, for consistency, and for systems that could support exchange across distance. Questions of value, of reliability, and of coordination began to take on greater importance. In response, practices began to develop, ways of measuring, of agreeing, and of organizing exchange that allowed it to continue with greater confidence. And through these practices, the foundations of more complex systems began to form. These developments did not replace the local rhythms of life. They existed alongside them, adding another layer to the way people experience the world, one that connected village and market, land and movement, stability and change. And in the years that followed, these connections would continue to strengthen. Routes would become more defined, exchanges more frequent, and certain places would grow in importance, gradually transforming from simple gathering points into centers of activity. And as this transformation unfolded, the world would begin to take on a different shape, one in which movement, exchange, and connection would play an increasingly central role. And within these quiet spaces, a different kind of structure was beginning to form. And it was within this growing network that new forms of organization, new communities, and new ways of life would begin to emerge, shaping the character of the age in ways that would continue to evolve over time. As these paths of exchange became more familiar, and as movement between regions continued to increase, certain places began to change in quiet but lasting ways. Not through sudden transformation, but through steady accumulation, as people returned again and again to the same locations, bringing with them goods, ideas, and a growing sense of connection. Where routes crossed, where rivers met, and where markets had once gathered only occasionally, more permanent settlements began to form. At first modest, shaped by necessity, yet over time these places expanded, gradually taking on the character of towns. The workshop was steady, not rushed, but never still. Each task flowing into the next without interruption. These towns did not appear as planned creations. They emerged from activity, from the repeated presence of traders, craftsmen, and travelers, each contributing in small ways to the development of a space that could support more than temporary exchange. Buildings began to cluster more closely together, workshops, storage spaces, and homes forming patterns that reflected both function and proximity. And within these growing spaces, a different rhythm of life began to take shape, one that moved with the flow of activity rather than the cycles of the field. A craftsman working with practiced hands might measure time not in hours, but in the completion of each piece. For those who lived within these towns, daily life carried a new sense of variation. The sounds of work, the movement of people, and the presence of goods from different regions created an environment that was more dynamic than the villages from which many had come. Craftsmanship became more specialized. Individuals focused on particular skills, refining them over time, and contributing to a system where goods were produced not only for local use, but for exchange across wider networks. Markets, once occasional, became more regular, and with this regularity came structure, designated spaces, agreed practices, and a growing expectation that exchange could take place within a predictable framework. At the same time, these towns required new forms of organization. As populations grew, questions of order, responsibility, and cooperation became more immediate. And in response, communities began to develop ways of governing themselves, balancing individual activity with shared needs. Walls in some places were built or strengthened, not only for defense, but as a way of defining space, marking the boundary between the town and the surrounding land, and creating a sense of identity for those who lived within it. As I reflect on this development, there is a feeling of gathering, a movement inward where people, resources, and activity came together, forming centers that connected the wider world in more concentrated ways. For many, the town represented opportunity, a place where one could learn a trade, participate in exchange, and experience a form of life that was different from the steady rhythms of the countryside. And yet, this life was not without its own demands. Space was limited, activity constant, and the balance between growth and order required ongoing attention. Yet, within these challenges, communities adapted, creating structures that allowed them to continue and expand. Over time, these towns would grow in both size and influence, becoming not only centers of trade, but also of culture, governance, and connection, shaping the way regions interacted and how people understood their place within a wider network. And in the years that followed, these developments would continue to evolve, giving rise to groups who would organize themselves around shared work, shared standards, and shared responsibility. And over time, this rhythm would begin to shape more than just the work itself. And it was within these growing communities that a new form of organization would begin to take shape, a one that would define how skills were learned, how work was structured, and how individuals found their place within the expanding life of the town. As these towns continued to grow, and as more people gathered within their walls to take part in trade, craft, and exchange, the need for structure began to emerge more clearly, not imposed from above, but shaped from within, as those who shared the same work sought ways to organize, protect, and refine what they did. In this environment, groups began to form, not loosely, but with intention, bringing together individuals who practiced the same craft, who understood the same materials, and who faced the same challenges in their daily work. Streets filled with workshops, each marked by its own sound, its own pace, created a city that moved through craft as much as trade. These were the beginnings of guilds, communities within the town that provided both identity and structure, offering a way for craftsmen and traders to connect their individual efforts into something more stable and consistent. Within these groups, knowledge was not left to chance. It was guided, passed carefully from one generation to the next, through observation, through practice, and through the close relationship between those who taught and those who learned. A master craftsman might see his work not as individual effort, but as part of something shared, something that would continue beyond him. Apprentices began their journey by watching, assisting, and gradually understanding the rhythm of the craft. Over time, with patience and repetition, they developed their skills, and moving step by step toward greater independence until they could contribute fully to the work of the guild. In this way, skill became something shared, not owned by one, but maintained by many, protected through standards that ensured quality, consistency, and trust, both within the community and among those who relied on their work. At the same time, guilds provided more than structure for craft. They offered support, a sense of belonging, and a network that could respond when individuals faced difficulty, ensuring that no one stood entirely alone within the uncertainties of town life. Rules began to take shape, not rigid at first, but gradually defined, guiding how work was done, how goods were produced, and how relationships between members were maintained, creating a balance between individual effort and collective responsibility. As I reflect on this development, there is something quietly cooperative in the way these systems formed, not driven by competition alone, but by the understanding that shared standards could strengthen both the work itself and the community that depended upon it. For those living within these towns, guilds became part of the rhythm of life, influencing not only how work was organized, but how identity was understood, linking individuals to a craft, to a group, and to a place within the broader structure of the town. And over time, these organizations would grow in influence, shaping local economies, participating in governance, and contributing to the development of towns as centers of both production and connection. Yet, even as these systems brought order, they also required balance. Expectations needed to be met, standards maintained, and relationships carefully managed. And within this balance, the life of the town continued to evolve. In the years that followed, these patterns of organization would deepen, becoming more defined, more influential, and more central to the way society functioned. And alongside this growth, Another force would continue to shape the direction of life across both town and countryside, one that extended beyond craft and trade, offering meaning, structure, and continuity in ways that touched every level of society. And in this shared structure, influence would begin to grow in ways not immediately visible. And as this influence reached its height, the balance between spiritual authority and worldly life would become one of the defining features of the age. As towns grew more active, and as systems of work, trade, and organization became more clearly defined, another presence continued to move quietly through every layer of life, not always seen as separate, yet deeply woven into the way people understood the world around them. The Church, which had once offered stability in a time of uncertainty, now stood as one of the most enduring structures across both countryside and town. Its influence extending not through force, but through continuity, shared belief, and the rhythm of practices that connected people across distance and time. A cathedral space, filled with stillness rather than sound, held a presence that extended beyond the moment, beyond the individual. In villages, the local church remained a familiar center, a place where life's moments were marked, where gatherings took place, and where a sense of meaning could be found within the repetition of daily existence. In towns, larger churches and cathedrals began to rise, their presence shaping not only the skyline, but also the identity of the communities around them. Places where people came together, not only for worship, but for connection, reflection, and shared experience. A visitor, standing beneath its height, might not understand its structure, only the feeling of being part of something larger. And beyond these visible spaces, the structure of the church extended further, through networks of clergy, through communication between regions, and through systems that connected distant communities into a broader whole. For many, this connection offered a sense of unity that went beyond local boundaries, linking individuals to something larger, something that remained constant even as the world around them continued to change. At the same time, the Church played a role in shaping how life was understood, guiding moral thought, offering explanations, and providing a framework through which events, both expected and unexpected, could be interpreted. Education, in its early forms, often took place within this sphere. Knowledge preserved, taught, and passed forward through institutions that were closely tied to religious life, ensuring that learning, though limited in reach, remained continuous. As I reflect on this influence, there is a sense that the Church did not stand apart from society, but moved within it, shaping daily rhythms, influencing decisions, and providing a structure that was both spiritual and practical. For those in positions of authority, the relationship with the Church remained important, offering legitimacy, guidance, and a connection to a wider network that extended beyond individual regions. And through this relationship, power and belief continued to align in ways that reinforced one another. And yet, this influence was not without complexity. As the reach of the Church expanded, questions of authority, responsibility, and balance began to emerge, requiring careful navigation between spiritual purpose and worldly presence. In the lives of ordinary people, however, this complexity was often felt more gently, through familiar rituals, through shared traditions, and through the quiet reassurance that came from belonging to something that endured across generations. And in the years that followed, the presence of the Church would continue to shape the character of the age, influencing not only belief, but also culture, learning, and the organization of society itself. Yet, even as this influence reached its height, the structures of power, both spiritual and temporal, would soon be drawn into movements that extended beyond local life, into journeys, conflicts, and encounters that would connect distant regions in new and unexpected ways. And as this presence expanded, its influence would begin to reach far beyond these walls. And as these movements began to take form, the world would once again expand outward, carrying with it the ideas, beliefs, and ambitions that had been shaped within these communities. As the influence of the Church continued to extend across towns and countryside, and as belief remained closely woven into the rhythms of daily life, attention began, gradually, to turn outward. Beyond familiar lands, toward regions that had long been known, yet now felt more distant, more uncertain, and more deeply connected to shared meaning. Stories traveled along the same routes that carried goods, carried by pilgrims, by travelers, and by those who moved between regions, bringing with them accounts of places far to the east, where sites of spiritual importance stood, and where conditions were said to be changing in ways that caused concern among those who listened. A traveler, carrying these stories across long distances, might repeat them differently each time, not changing the meaning, but shaping how they were understood. These accounts did not arrive all at once, nor did they take a single form. They were shaped by distance, by memory, and by the perspectives of those who carried them. Yet, over time, a pattern began to emerge. One that spoke of difficulty, of restriction, and of a need that extended beyond any one community. For many, these stories stirred a sense of connection, not immediate but gradual, linking the familiar practices of daily life to places that, though far away, held significance within the shared framework of belief. Someone hearing these accounts might not question their accuracy, only feel the quiet sense that something far away was somehow connected to their own life. At the same time, within the Western lands, the structures of society had reached a point of relative stability. Systems of land, of obligation, and of authority were in place, providing a foundation from which larger movements could begin to take shape. It was within this context that a call was made, not as a command imposed upon all, but as an invitation that resonated differently with each who heard it. A call that spoke of journey, of purpose, and of the possibility of participating in something that extended beyond the boundaries of everyday life. For some, the response came from devotion, a desire to act in accordance with belief, to travel to places held as sacred, and to take part in a movement that carried spiritual meaning. For others, the motivations were more varied, shaped by opportunity, by the promise of change, or by the chance to move beyond the limitations of their current circumstances. Yet, within this diversity of response, there was a shared direction, a movement outward, toward lands that lay beyond the familiar horizon. Preparations began gradually, not as a single coordinated effort, but as a gathering of intentions, groups forming, resources assembled, and routes considered, all unfolding over time, shaped by both anticipation and uncertainty. For those who chose to take part, the journey itself would become central. Long distances, unfamiliar lands, and the experience of moving far beyond the known, each step carrying both expectation and challenge. As I reflect on this moment, there is a sense of expansion, not only in geography but in perspective, a turning outward that connected local lives to distant places, and that brought together belief, movement, and purpose in a way that had not been seen for generations. And yet, even as this movement began, its outcome remained unclear, shaped by countless factors, by the realities of distance, and by the interactions between worlds that had developed along different paths. In the years that followed, these journeys would reach their destinations, encounters would unfold, and the connections between regions would deepen in ways both expected and unforeseen. Yet at this moment, standing at the beginning of this movement, there was only the call itself, carried across lands, received in different ways, and gradually transforming intention into action. And yet, what began as distant concern would soon take a more immediate form. And as these journeys moved forward, the story of this age would extend beyond the boundaries of the Western world, entering into a phase of contact, exchange, and challenge that would shape its direction for years to come. As the call began to spread across the Western lands, and as more individuals chose to take part in this movement beyond the familiar horizon, what followed was not a single unified departure, but a gradual unfolding of journeys, groups forming at different times, in different places, each shaped by its own circumstances, yet all moving in a shared direction. These early movements were varied, some organized with preparation and support, others less structured, guided more by intention than by plan. And within this diversity, the experience of the journey itself became central, shaping how the movement would be remembered. The road ahead was not always clear, stretching across unfamiliar land, where each step forward felt both certain and unknown at the same time. For those who set out, the path eastward was long and uncertain, stretching across lands that differed in language, landscape, and custom. And as they moved forward, each step brought new challenges, requiring adaptation, patience, and the ability to continue despite what was unfamiliar. Along the way, encounters took place, with communities both known and unknown, with allies and with those whose interests differed. And through these interactions, the journey became not only a movement of people, but a meeting of worlds. A traveler, moving with the group, might not have known where the journey would end, only that turning back was no longer part of the path. In some places, progress was steady. In others, it slowed, shaped by distance, by conditions, and by the realities of sustaining such a movement over time. Yet, gradually, these groups continued forward, drawing closer to the regions that had first inspired the call. When they reached these lands, what followed was not a single moment, but a series of events. Efforts to establish presence, to secure positions, and to navigate a landscape that was already shaped by its own long history and its own systems of life. For those involved, these experiences were complex, shaped by belief, by circumstance, and by the challenges of operating far from what was familiar. And while later accounts would focus on particular moments, the reality was one of ongoing effort, adjustment, and uncertainty. Over time, positions were established, not without difficulty and not without change, yet enough to create a presence that extended beyond the initial journey, forming places where those who had traveled could remain, organize, and continue their lives in a new setting. As I reflect on this period, there is a sense that the significance of these journeys lies not only in their outcomes, but in the connections they created, linking regions that had developed separately, bringing them into contact in ways that would have lasting effects. For those in the Western lands, these developments expanded their understanding of the world, making distant regions more immediate and weaving new experiences into the broader pattern of life. And yet, even as these new presences were established, they remained part of a larger and more complex landscape, one that required constant attention, adaptation, and the ability to respond to changing conditions. In the years that followed, these connections would continue to evolve, shaped by both cooperation and tension, by exchange and by difference. And through this ongoing process, the relationship between regions would deepen in ways that were not always predictable. Yet, within these developments, new figures would emerge. Individuals whose leadership, perspective, and actions would come to define how this phase of history was understood. And in reaching these distant lands, they would begin to encounter a world very different from their own. And as these figures began to take shape within the story, the movement that had begun as a journey would enter a new stage, one defined not only by travel, but by leadership, encounter, and the shifting balance between worlds. And in reaching these distant lands, they would begin to encounter a world that did not respond as they expected. As these new presences in the eastern lands continued to take shape, and as connections between regions deepened through both movement and encounter, the balance within this wider landscape began, gradually, to shift, not suddenly, but through the emergence of leadership that brought new direction and new coherence to an already complex world. Among those who came to shape this period was a figure whose influence would extend beyond individual events, a leader whose role would come to reflect not only authority, but also the ability to unify, to organize, and to respond to the changing conditions of the time. Across these regions, messages moved between cities, carrying decisions that would take time to unfold, yet shape events far beyond their origin. Saladin emerged within a world that was already layered with different powers, traditions, and expectations, and rather than acting in isolation, his rise was connected to a broader effort to bring together regions that had, for a time, remained separate in both purpose and direction. Through careful leadership, alliances were formed, structures strengthened, and a sense of shared direction began to develop. Not imposed quickly, but built over time, through decisions that balanced immediate needs with longer-term stability. Saladin, in moments of quiet planning, may have considered not only the present, but the balance that would need to be maintained over time. In this way, his influence grew, not only through action, but through the ability to create cohesion where fragmentation had existed. And as this cohesion increased, the balance between the different regions involved in these ongoing encounters began to change. For those who experienced these shifts, the changes were not always defined by single moments, but by a gradual awareness that the conditions surrounding them were evolving, that what had once been uncertain was becoming more organized, more directed, and more intentional. At the same time, interactions between worlds continued, not only through conflict, but also through exchange, ideas, practices, and experiences moving between regions, shaping perspectives in ways that extended beyond immediate events. As I reflect on this period, there is something measured in the way leadership could alter the course of events. Not through sudden transformation, but through steady influence, guiding developments that might otherwise have remained fragmented. For those in the Western lands, the presence of such leadership introduced a new understanding of the regions they had come to know, one that required adaptation, reconsideration, and a recognition that the balance was no longer the same as before. And yet, even within this shifting balance, the connections that had been formed did not disappear. They continued, shaped now by new conditions, by changing leadership, and by the ongoing interaction between different ways of life. Over time, these developments would lead to further adjustments, efforts to respond, to reorganize, and to navigate a landscape that was no longer defined by initial movement alone, but by the relationships that had grown from it. Yet within these changes, there was also a gradual movement toward conclusion, not immediate and not clearly defined at first, but present in the way that structures evolved and in the way that attention began, slowly, to turn back toward the lands from which these journeys had begun. And in the years that followed, the focus would begin to shift once more. From outward movement to inward reflection, from expansion to reassessment, and from connection to the question of what would remain when these encounters had passed. And through this careful shaping of direction, the balance between these worlds would begin to change. And as this shift unfolded, the story of this age would begin to move toward a quieter phase, one shaped not by distant journeys, but by the conditions that had developed within the lands themselves. As these encounters between regions continued, and as leadership and conditions shifted across the lands where these journeys had once converged, the momentum that had carried the earlier movements began, gradually, to change, not ending at once but softening over time, as the direction that had once seemed clear became less certain. The journeys did not stop immediately. Groups still formed, intentions still gathered, and efforts continued to move outward. Yet, with each passing phase, the sense of unified purpose began to thin, shaped by experience, by distance, and by the realities that had emerged along the way. The movement of people became less certain. Routes that had once felt clear now carried hesitation, as if the path itself had begun to fade. For those who had taken part in earlier movements, the memory of what had been encountered remained, shaping expectations, influencing decisions, and altering how future journeys were understood. And through this accumulation of experience, the nature of participation itself began to shift. At the same time, conditions within the regions involved were changing. Structures that had been established required maintenance, resources needed to be sustained, and the complexities of maintaining presence in distant lands became more apparent. A participant returning home might find that the world he left no longer felt exactly the same. These challenges did not arrive all at once. They developed gradually, revealing themselves through the need for coordination, through the difficulty of distance, and through the evolving relationships between those who lived within these regions. In response, attention began to turn inward, not completely and not uniformly, but enough to reshape priorities. Communities once focused on outward movement began to consider stability closer to home, balancing ambition with practicality. As this happened, the sense of continuity that had once carried the movement forward became less consistent. Individual efforts replaced broader coordination, and what had once been a shared direction became more varied, more localized, and less defined. For those observing these changes, the shift may not have appeared dramatic. There was no single moment that marked an ending. Instead, there was a gradual easing, a quiet reduction in intensity, as the movement that had once expanded outward began to settle into something more limited. And yet, the effects of these journeys did not disappear. Connections that had been formed remained. Knowledge, experience, and awareness continued to shape how regions understood one another, and the influence of these encounters extended beyond their immediate context. As I reflect on this period, there is a sense that endings often take this form, not defined by a single event, but by a series of adjustments that, over time, lead to a different direction, one that feels less like a conclusion and more like a transition. For many, life returned to patterns that were more familiar. The rhythms of land, of town, and of community, once again taking precedence over distant movement. Yet, these patterns were not unchanged. They carried within them the traces of what had come before. And in the years that followed, attention would continue to shift, away from distant journeys and toward developments within the lands themselves, where new ideas, new forms of organization, and new ways of understanding the world were beginning to take shape. And as this inward focus grew, the next phase of this story would begin not through movement across distance, but through reflection, learning, and the gradual transformation of thought and expression. And in this quiet shift, attention would begin to turn inward once more. And it was within this quieter turning inward that a different kind of change would begin to unfold, one that would shape the direction of society in ways that were less visible at first, yet deeply lasting over time. As the movements that had carried people across distant lands began to soften, and as attention gradually returned to the structures within the Western world, a different kind of development began to take shape, one that did not depend on expansion or movement, but on reflection, study, and the careful gathering of knowledge over time. In certain towns and cities, where exchange and connection had already brought people together, spaces began to emerge where learning could be shared more intentionally, not as isolated effort, but as a collective activity shaped by discussion, guidance, and the gradual organization of ideas. In a quiet space of learning, voices did not rise, but moved steadily as ideas passed from one person to another. These were the early beginnings of universities, not yet defined by the formal structures that would come later, but already forming around groups of teachers and students who sought to understand the world through inquiry, interpretation, and the preservation of knowledge. At the heart of this development was a desire for clarity, to explore questions that had long been present, to examine traditions that had been passed down, and to bring together different strands of thought into a more structured form. A student, listening closely, might not yet understand everything being discussed, only that something within it felt important. Learning, in this context, was not separated from belief. It moved alongside it, drawing from texts, from teachings, and from the accumulated wisdom of earlier generations. Yet, at the same time, it began to take on its own rhythm, one that encouraged exploration within the framework that had been established. Students gathered in these centers, often traveling from distant regions, bringing with them perspectives shaped by their own experiences, and contributing to an environment where ideas could be exchanged, refined, and developed further. Teachers, too, played an essential role, guiding discussion, presenting interpretations, and helping to shape the direction of study, not by providing all answers, but by encouraging a process through which understanding could gradually deepen. As this process continued, certain patterns began to form. Areas of study became more defined, methods of teaching more consistent, and the relationship between teacher and student more structured, creating a system that allowed learning to be sustained across time. For those involved, life within these centers carried its own rhythm, one marked by conversation, by reading, and by the quiet effort of thinking through questions that did not always have immediate answers. And beyond these spaces, the influence of learning began to extend outward, shaping how ideas were understood, how knowledge was preserved, and how society itself began to reflect on its own structure and purpose. As I reflect on this period, there is a sense of stillness within movement, a turning inward that allowed the world to be considered not only through action, but through thought, where change came not from expansion, but from understanding. For many, this development did not replace the rhythms of daily life. Fields were still worked, towns still active, and systems of authority still in place. Yet alongside these, a quieter layer had emerged, one that offered a different way of engaging with the world. And in the years that followed, this layer would continue to grow, shaping not only learning, but also culture, expression, and the ways in which people understood both the past and the possibilities of the future. Yet, even as this growth brought new clarity, it also revealed new questions about balance, about authority, and about the relationship between tradition and change. And as these ideas continued to gather, they would begin to shape how the world itself was understood. And as these questions deepened, the story of this age would begin to move toward a period where both growth and challenge would exist together, shaping a world that was becoming more connected, yet also more complex in ways that were not yet fully understood. As centers of learning continued to grow, and as thought and reflection began to shape how people understood their world, another form of expression began to emerge, not through words alone, but through structures that rose slowly into the sky, carrying with them both meaning and presence. Across towns and cities where communities had gathered and grown more connected, the desire to create spaces of greater scale and beauty began to take form. Not as sudden ambition, but as a gradual extension of what had already existed, shaped by devotion, by skill, and by the collective effort of many. These were the beginnings of what would later be recognized as Gothic cathedrals, structures that seemed to reach upward, not only in height, but in intention, built over years, often across generations, each part added with care, each detail reflecting both craft and purpose. Stone was shaped and lifted, piece by piece. Arches formed that carried weight in new ways, allowing walls to rise higher, openings to expand, and light to enter more freely into spaces that had once been more enclosed. Within these spaces, light itself became part of the design, passing through colored glass, spreading softly across floors and walls, creating an atmosphere that shifted throughout the day, marking time not through sound, but through the quiet movement of illumination. For those who entered, the experience was different from the structures that had come before. The sense of space, of height, and of openness created an environment that encouraged stillness, reflection, and a feeling of connection that extended beyond the immediate. The construction of these cathedrals was not the work of a single individual. It brought together craftsmen, builders, planners, and communities, each contributing in ways that reflected both skill and shared intention. Work continued over long periods, sometimes beyond the lives of those who began it. And in this continuity, there was a sense of patience, an understanding that the creation of something lasting required time, care, and a willingness to build for the future. As I reflect on these structures, there is something deeply calm in their presence, not only in their form, but in the process that brought them into being, a gradual rising, shaped by many hands, guided by a shared vision that unfolded slowly across years. For the communities around them, these cathedrals became more than buildings. They were points of gathering, of identity, and of continuity, places where life's moments were marked and where the broader rhythms of society found expression in visible form. At the same time, they reflected the developments that had been taking place in learning and organization, the refinement of skill, the coordination of effort, and the ability to bring together complex elements into a unified whole. And yet, even as these structures reached upward, life at ground level continued. Markets remained active, fields still worked, and daily routines carried on, creating a balance between aspiration and continuity. In the years that followed, these forms of expression would continue to evolve, influencing not only architecture but also art, culture, and the ways in which people represented their understanding of the world. Yet, alongside this growth, there remained a quieter layer of life, one shaped by routine, by habit, and by the everyday experiences of those who lived within these changing environments. And as this balance between expression and daily life continued, the story of this age would turn once more toward the people themselves, toward the details of how they lived, what they valued, and how their world felt from within. And in that return to the everyday, a deeper understanding of this period would begin to take shape, one that revealed not only its structures, but the lives that moved quietly within them. As these structures of stone and light continued to rise, and as learning and expression found new forms within towns and cities, yet the deeper rhythm of life remained grounded in something more familiar, in the small, repeated moments that shaped each day, and in the quiet details that often passed without notice. For most, life was not defined by grand developments or distant changes, but by the steady patterns that returned again and again, waking with the morning light, tending to work, sharing meals, and moving through routines that, while simple, carried a sense of continuity and meaning. In towns, the day began with movement, shops opening, tools prepared, and the sound of work gradually filling the narrow streets. Craftsmen returning to their tasks, merchants arranging their goods, and apprentices continuing the careful process of learning through doing. In the countryside, the rhythm followed the land, fields calling for attention, animals tended, and tasks shaped by the season, each action part of a cycle that connected past, present, and future through repetition. Homes, whether within town walls or beyond them, were spaces of both work and rest, places where families gathered, where knowledge was passed quietly from one generation to the next, and where the boundaries between daily tasks and shared life often overlapped. Time, in this world, was experienced differently, not measured primarily by exact hours but by moments. The position of the sun, the changing of light, the familiar sequence of activities that guided the flow of the day. And within this rhythm, there was a balance between effort and pause, periods of work followed by moments of rest, not always separate, but woven together in a way that allowed life to continue without interruption. As I reflect on these details, there is something deeply steady in the way life unfolded, not driven by urgency but by continuity, where meaning was found not in sudden change, but in the quiet persistence of what was known. For many, this way of life offered a sense of place, a connection to land, to community, and to the roles that defined each individual within a larger whole, even as the world beyond continued to shift and expand. And yet, beneath this steadiness, change was still present, carried in small adjustments, in new ideas, in the gradual blending of old and new practices, each one subtle, yet part of a broader transformation that was still unfolding. In towns, connections continued to grow, trade expanding, knowledge spreading, and communities becoming more complex, while in the countryside, improvements in agriculture continued to shape both stability and growth. These layers of change did not replace the everyday, they existed alongside it, creating a world that was both familiar and evolving, stable and shifting, quiet and connected. And in the years that followed, this balance would be tested. Not immediately, and not without warning, but through developments that would begin to challenge the structures that had supported this way of life for generations. Yet, even as those challenges approached, the rhythm of daily life continued, steady, familiar, and grounded in patterns that had endured through many changes before. And it is within this quiet persistence that we begin to see not only how people lived, but how they adapted, carrying forward what they knew, even as the world around them prepared, once again, it to change. As these familiar rhythms of daily life continued, and as communities moved through their patterns of work, connection, and routine, something began to change, not immediately visible and not fully understood at first, but present in small signs that gradually drew attention. News began to travel along the same routes that had once carried trade and connection. Reports of illness in distant regions, of communities affected by something that moved without clear pattern, and of conditions that seemed to spread beyond the places where they had first appeared. At first, these accounts felt far away, part of a world that, though connected, still seemed distant enough to remain separate from everyday life. Yet, over time, the distance began to narrow, and the reports became more immediate, more difficult to ignore. For those who encountered these changes directly, the experience was often quiet in its beginning, a sense that something was different, that the familiar rhythm had been interrupted in ways that were not easily explained. Communities responded as they could, drawing on what they knew, turning toward established practices, and seeking understanding within the frameworks that had guided them through earlier uncertainties. And yet, this situation was not easily contained. It moved across regions, following paths that connected towns and villages, and reaching places that had once seemed removed from such disturbances. As it spread, the patterns of daily life began to shift. Not all at once, but gradually. Gatherings became less frequent, movement more cautious, and the steady routines that had once defined each day began to feel less certain. For many, the experience was not one of constant intensity, but of ongoing change, a recognition that something larger was unfolding, and that the structures which had supported life for generations were now being tested in ways that were difficult to predict. In towns, activity slowed. Spaces that had once been filled with movement grew quieter, and the connections that had brought people together became more limited. While in the countryside, the rhythm of the land continued, yet was shaped by the same underlying uncertainty. As I reflect on this period, there is a sense of stillness within disruption, not defined by a single moment, but by a prolonged shift, where the familiar became uncertain, and where time itself seemed to move differently, marked by change rather than repetition. For those who lived through it, adaptation became essential, not always through clear solutions, but through small adjustments, caring for one another, reorganizing daily life, and finding ways to continue within altered conditions. And over time, these experiences would leave lasting impressions, shaping how communities understood vulnerability, connection, and the balance between stability and change. Yet, even as this disruption unfolded, life did not come to a halt. It continued in quieter forms, in smaller patterns, and in the persistence of those who remained within the structures that had been built over generations. And in the years that followed, the world would begin, gradually, to adjust once more, not returning exactly to what had been, but moving forward into a new phase, shaped by what had been experienced, and by the changes that had taken root beneath the surface. And as this movement toward renewal began, another challenge, different in form, yet equally shaping, would continue to unfold, one that would test not only communities, but the relationships between powers and the direction of entire regions. As communities continued to adjust in the wake of earlier disruptions, and as life gradually settled into new patterns shaped by both memory and adaptation, another form of challenge began to unfold, not as a single event, but as a series of tensions that extended across time, touching multiple generations. This was not a conflict defined by constant movement or continuous action. Rather, it unfolded in intervals, periods of activity followed by stretches of quiet, where life resumed its rhythm even as underlying tensions remained. At its center were questions of authority and inheritance, claims that reached across regions, linking lands and leadership in ways that were not easily resolved. And as these questions persisted, they shaped the direction of events over many years. For those living within the affected regions, the experience was not one of constant upheaval, but of recurring uncertainty. Moments when the familiar was interrupted, followed by times when daily life continued much as before. In towns, markets still opened and work continued, while in the countryside, fields were still tended, and the cycles of the land remained unchanged. Yet, beneath this continuity, there was an awareness that conditions could shift, that stability was not always guaranteed. Leaders came and went, strategies changed, and the balance between regions shifted gradually, not through a single decisive moment, but through accumulation, small changes that, over time, shaped the broader course of the conflict. For many, the passage of time became a defining feature, years blending into decades, and generations growing up within a world where this tension was simply part of the background, something known, yet not always at the forefront of daily thought. As I reflect on this period, there is a sense that such long conflicts become part of the landscape itself, not always visible, yet always present, shaping expectations, influencing decisions, and quietly altering how people understand their world. And within this extended unfolding, moments of clarity would appear, instances where direction shifted more noticeably, where leadership played a more visible role, and where the course of events seemed, briefly, to gather into focus. Yet, even these moments were part of a larger pattern, one that continued beyond them, returning once more to a slower rhythm, where change occurred not through sudden transformation, but through gradual adjustment. In the years that followed, this long conflict would eventually move toward resolution, not as a sharp ending, but as a process of closing, where attention turned once again toward rebuilding, toward stability, and toward the shaping of a new phase. And as this transition began, the experience of these years would remain, not only in memory, but in the structures, relationships, and understandings that had been formed through time. And it is within this reflection that we begin to see how even extended periods of uncertainty can give rise to new perspectives, shaping how people move forward and how they begin, once again, to rebuild what has been altered. As the long patterns of conflict began to settle, and as communities gradually returned their attention to rebuilding what had been strained or altered, a quieter transformation was already taking place. Not through sudden change, but through a renewed engagement with ideas that had been waiting, preserved across time, and now beginning to re-emerge in new forms. In certain regions, especially in the towns of the Italian peninsula, where trade had long connected different parts of the world, there was a growing presence of texts, objects, and knowledge that carried traces of earlier civilizations. Works that had survived through careful copying, through movement across regions, and through the steady preservation within centers of learning. These materials did not arrive all at once. They accumulated gradually, and as they did, they invited attention, not only to what they contained, but to how they could be understood, interpreted, and applied within the present. Scholars began to gather around these texts, reading, discussing, and comparing, not with the intention of replacing what was known, but of expanding it, bringing together different strands of thought, and allowing them to exist alongside one another. In this process, there was a subtle shift. Learning was no longer only about preserving what had been handed down. It began gently, to include questioning, observing, and reconsidering, not in opposition to tradition, but in conversation with it. Art, too, reflected this change. Forms became more attentive to the natural world, to proportion, to perspective, and to the way light and space could be represented. And through this attention, the act of creation became not only an expression of belief, but also an exploration of observation. Workshops formed where skills were passed carefully from master to student, where techniques were refined through repetition, and where each generation contributed something slightly different from the last, not breaking from tradition, but shaping it over time. For those living within these towns, the change may not have felt dramatic. Daily life continued, markets opened, crafts were practiced, and routines remained. Yet within this continuity, there was a quiet expansion of awareness, a sense that the world could be understood in more than one way. Patrons, too, played a role in this development, supporting the work of artists and thinkers, not only for personal recognition, but as part of a broader participation in this emerging culture, where creativity, learning, and identity began to intertwine. As I reflect on this period, there is something deeply balanced in its movement. Not a rejection of the past, but a return to it. Not as something fixed, but as something that could be revisited, reinterpreted, and brought into the present with new understanding. There is a quiet lesson here, that renewal does not always come from creating something entirely new, but from seeing what already exists with clearer attention, and from allowing that attention to guide what comes next. Over time, this way of thinking would begin to spread, not rapidly, but steadily, carried through people, through works of art, through texts, and through the growing connections between regions. And as it spread, it would begin to shape not only learning and creation, but also how individuals understood themselves, their place in the world, their capacity to observe, and their role in shaping what was yet to come. Yet, even as this renewal unfolded, it remained grounded in the rhythms of daily life, never fully separate from the world in which it existed, but woven into it, quietly, persistently, and with a sense of continuity that connected past, present, and future. And in the years that followed, this shift in thought would begin to open new directions, leading outward once again, not through conflict, but through curiosity, and through the gradual desire to explore a world that was becoming once more wider than before. As this renewed attention to learning, art, and observation continued to take shape, and as communities became more aware of both the past and their place within the present, a familiar impulse began to return, not suddenly but gradually, the desire to look beyond what was known and to understand what lay further still. This movement outward did not begin in isolation. It was shaped by many of the developments that had come before, by the growth of trade, by the refinement of knowledge, and by the increasing confidence of societies that had, over time, rebuilt stability within their own regions. In coastal towns where the movement of goods had long connected distant places, there was a growing attention to the sea itself, not only as a boundary, but as a path, something that could be studied, navigated, and understood with greater precision. Knowledge of winds, currents, and routes began to accumulate, not through sudden discovery, but through repeated journeys, careful observation, and the sharing of experience between those who traveled. Tools, too, began to improve. Instruments that helped determine direction, maps that reflected a gradually expanding understanding of geography, and methods of navigation that allowed travelers to move with more confidence across distances that had once seemed uncertain. Ships were adapted over time, shaped by both tradition and innovation, designed to carry not only goods, but also the intention to travel further, to remain at sea longer, and to return with knowledge as well as material exchange. For those who took part in these journeys, the experience was not one of immediate success. It required patience, repeated attempts, and the willingness to learn from each voyage, adjusting course not only across water, but across understanding. And yet, as these efforts continued, the boundaries of the known world began, slowly, to expand. Coastlines became more familiar, distances more measurable, and the idea of what was possible began to shift. For those who remained within towns and villages, these changes arrived more gradually, carried back through stories, through goods, and through the subtle awareness that the world was larger, more connected, and more open than it had once appeared. As I reflect on this movement, there is something deeply consistent in the way exploration unfolds. Not driven by certainty, but by curiosity. Not defined by immediate results, but by persistence over time. There is a quiet lesson here, that understanding grows through repetition, through the willingness to return, to try again, and to move forward even when the path is not fully clear. At the same time, this expansion did not replace the structures of daily life. Fields were still worked, towns remained active, and communities continued their routines. Yet, alongside this stability, a new layer had formed, one that extended outward, connecting the local to the distant. Over time, these journeys would begin to reach further, opening connections that had not been part of earlier networks, and bringing new knowledge into the systems that had already been established. And as this process continued, the world itself began to feel different, not because it had changed suddenly, but because it was being seen differently, understood through a wider perspective, and approached with a growing sense of possibility. Yet even as this horizon expanded, it remained connected to the same patterns that had shaped earlier centuries, continuity and change existing together, each influencing the other in quiet and lasting ways. And in the years that followed, this outward movement would continue to develop, shaping not only geography, but also thought, influencing how people understood distance, connection, and their own place within a world that was no longer defined by familiar limits. And as this awareness deepened, the pace of the story itself would begin to slow once more, not because there was less to discover, but because what remained was no longer movement alone, but reflection on how far that movement had already carried them. As these journeys continued to extend the boundaries of the known world, and as knowledge, experience, and connection gradually reshaped how people understood their place within it, there was also a quieter realization beginning to take form, that something familiar, something long-standing, was slowly giving way to a different way of seeing. The structures that had defined earlier centuries, land, loyalty, layered authority, and the rhythms of village and town did not disappear. They remained steady and present. Yet they were no longer the only framework through which life was understood. Alongside them, new perspectives had begun to settle, ways of thinking shaped by observation, by inquiry, and by the growing awareness that the world was broader, more detailed, and more interconnected than it had once seemed. This shift did not arrive as a clear turning point. There was no single moment that marked the end of one age and the beginning of another. Instead, it unfolded gradually, almost quietly, as ideas changed, as habits adapted, and as attention moved gently in new directions. For those living within this time, the change may have been barely noticeable. Daily routines continued. Fields were still worked, workshops remained active, and towns continued to grow. Yet within this continuity, something deeper had shifted. The way the world was understood, and the way people began to see their place within it. In centers of learning, discussions expanded, not only preserving what had been known, but exploring what could be questioned. In workshops, artists continued to refine their craft, bringing greater attention to detail, to proportion, and to the observation of the natural world. And along routes of trade and travel, new information continued to circulate, connecting regions in ways that had once seemed distant. As I reflect on this moment, there is something deeply calm in the way such a transition unfolds. Not through disruption, but through accumulation, where each small change adds to the next, until the overall direction has quietly shifted. There is a lesson here, perhaps, like in how change often moves, not in sudden breaks, but in gentle reorientation, where what once seemed central becomes part of a larger whole, and where new perspectives emerge without erasing what came before. For many, life continued much as it always had, shaped by work, by family, and by the familiar patterns of each day. Yet these lives were now connected to a world that was expanding, to ideas that were evolving, and to possibilities that had not been as visible before. And over time, this quiet transformation would become more apparent, not as a departure from the past, but as a continuation, a gradual movement into a different phase, where understanding, exploration, and expression would take on new forms. Yet even as this new phase began to emerge, the story of what came before did not fade. It remained present in the structures, in the knowledge, and in the patterns that had been built across centuries. And in this way, the age does not end. It settles, becoming part of the foundation for what follows, carrying forward its lessons, its rhythms, and its quiet continuity into the unfolding of the next chapter. And as this awareness gently settles, the need to follow each detail begins to soften, replaced by a broader sense of understanding, a feeling of having moved through time and of now arriving, slowly, at a place of rest. As the shapes of this age begin to settle, and as the details of its many movements soften into a quieter understanding, what remains is not a single event, nor a single idea, but a sense of continuity, a feeling that everything we have followed has been part of a larger flow, moving steadily, almost gently, across time. The rise and fall of structures, the forming of communities, the shifting of ideas. None of these stand alone, each one connected to what came before and to what would follow, each one part of a pattern that is not always visible in the moment, but becomes clearer when seen from a distance. For those who lived within these centuries, life did not feel like history. It felt like the present, like the work of each day, the familiarity of each season, and the quiet repetition of routines that gave shape to their world. And yet, within that ordinary rhythm, change was always present, sometimes noticeable, sometimes not. Moving slowly through habits, through ideas, and through the ways people understood their place within the world around them. As I reflect on this, there is something deeply calming in the realization that time does not rush. It unfolds, allowing each moment to exist fully before it becomes part of something larger. There is a lesson here, perhaps, not in any single event, but in the way all events connect, that nothing is entirely separate, and that even the smallest shift can, over time, become part of a much wider transformation. The roads that once carried the movement of empire, the fields that sustained generations, the towns that gathered voices and trade, the cathedrals that rose slowly toward the sky. Each of these remains, not always in form, but in influence, in the way they shaped what followed. And even as new ages begin and new ideas take form, they do not emerge from emptiness. They grow from what already exists, shaped by memory, by experience, and by the quiet accumulation of what has come before. For those who listen now, there is no need to hold on to every detail, no need to remember each name or each place. What remains is the feeling of movement, the understanding that history is not a series of isolated moments, but a continuous unfolding. And in that understanding, there is space to rest, to allow the mind to soften, and to let the story settle, not as something that must be followed, but as something that has already carried you gently through time. As this awareness deepens, the edges of the story begin to fade, not disappearing, but becoming less defined, like distant shapes at the end of a long journey. And what remains is not the path itself, but the sense of having traveled it, slowly, steadily, without urgency. And as that sense begins to settle, the need to follow the story begins to fade, giving way to something quieter, something softer, something that asks for nothing more than stillness. As the movement of time settles into a quieter rhythm, and as the long path we have followed begins to soften at its edges, there is no longer a need to hold on to each detail, no need to trace each moment, or to keep each part clearly in mind. The story has already unfolded, gradually, steadily, carrying you across centuries without urgency. And now, it begins to rest, just as naturally as it once began. There is something calm in this letting go, in allowing what has been heard to settle into the background, not disappearing, but becoming lighter, less defined, like distant shapes at the end of a long journey. You may notice that the mind, which once followed each step, each place, each change, begins to slow, no longer moving forward, no longer searching for what comes next. And that is enough. There is nothing more you need to follow, nothing more you need to understand. Only the quiet presence of what remains, a sense of having traveled without effort, a sense of having arrived without needing to stop anywhere in particular. As I reflect on this moment, there is a gentle lesson in release, that understanding does not come from holding tightly, but from allowing things to settle, to take their place naturally, without force. And in that release, there is space, space for stillness, space for rest, Space for the mind to soften, just as the story has softened. The past continues, whether we follow it or not. Time continue, whether we observe it or not. And here, in this moment, you are not required to do anything at all, not to remember, not to focus, not to stay awake, only to rest, to let the breath move gently, to let the body grow still, to let the thoughts drift, without direction, without effort. And as this stillness deepens, the edges of awareness begin to fade just a little more, not suddenly, not completely, but enough to feel the quiet beginning of rest. How the story no longer needs your attention. It continues on its own, and you can simply remain here, in this calm space, where nothing more is needed, where nothing more is expected, where everything has already been enough. And as this quiet continues, rest comes more easily, more naturally, without effort, without thought, just a gentle drifting into stillness. And now, there is nothing more to follow, no paths to trace, no stories to continue. Everything has already unfolded, gently, completely, just as it needed to. You can let it all go now, every detail, every place, every moment. There's no need to hold on to any of it. Let the mind soften just a little more. Let the thoughts slow and drift, without direction, without effort. There is nowhere you need to go, nothing you need to understand, nothing you need to finish, only this quiet moment, steady, simple, and calm. Notice the breath as it comes and goes naturally, without trying to change it. And with each breath, the body grows a little heavier, a little more at rest, a little more still. The space around you feels softer now, quieter, as if everything has gently stepped back, leaving only calm behind. If a thought appears, you don't need to follow it. You don't need to hold it. It can pass, like a distant sound, fading on its own. There's nothing missing, nothing unfinished. Everything is exactly as it is meant to be. And in this stillness, rest comes naturally, quietly, without effort. The story has ended, but there is no ending to hold on to. Only this gentle drifting, this soft, steady calm. And as you continue to rest, the mind grows quieter, the body more at ease, and the world fades just a little further away. Now, just rest and drift into quiet, into stillness, into sleep.